This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. Sophie was already in her pajamas when I got there, happily playing with some toys in the living room. Mr. and Mrs. Martin gave me the usual rundown: emergency numbers on the fridge, Sophie's bedtime routine, when they expected to be back. Everything seemed totally normal as they headed out the door. For the first hour or so, things were great. Sophie and I played with her dolls, read a few picture books, and had a snack of apple slices and peanut butter. She was such a sweet, easygoing kid. Around 8:30, I started her bedtime routine: bath, teeth brushing, one last story. I had just tucked Sophie into her crib when the house phone rang. Figuring it was probably the Martins checking in, I answered quickly so it wouldn't wake Sophie. But the voice on the other end sent chills down my spine. "Is little Sophie all tucked in with her favorite purple blanket?" a man's voice asked in a low, menacing tone. My blood ran cold. How did this stranger know about Sophie's blanket? I stammered out a, "Who is this?" but he just chuckled and hung up. Badly shaken, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I told myself it was probably just a wrong number, someone playing a stupid prank. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. About 20 minutes later, my cell phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sophie looks so peaceful when she sleeps, almost like a little angel." Pure terror gripped me. I raced to Sophie's room, heart pounding. She was still sleeping soundly in her crib, totally unaware. I scanned the windows, but saw nothing out of the ordinary in the darkness outside. With trembling hands, I called the police and explained the situation. They said they'd send a patrol car to do a drive-by, but since there was no sign of an actual break-in, it wasn't considered an emergency. I didn't want to wake Sophie or alarm the Martins unnecessarily, so I stayed put, constantly checking on her and peering out the windows. Every little noise made me jump. Around 10 p.m., the house phone rang again. Against my better judgment, I answered. The same chilling voice spoke. "You really should trim those rose bushes under Sophie's window. Makes it hard to get a good view inside." I slammed the phone down and ran to Sophie's room. The rose bushes he mentioned were clearly visible outside her window. Someone had to be out there, watching us. Frantic now, I called 911 again and begged them to send someone immediately. I also texted the Martins, asking them to come home as soon as possible. While waiting for help to arrive, I paced the house, checking and rechecking the locks. I considered taking Sophie and leaving, but was terrified of going outside where this creep might be waiting. Just as I heard a car pulling up outside, my phone chimed with another text. "Uh-oh, looks like the fun's over. But don't worry, I'll be seeing sweet little Sophie again soon." Seconds later, there was a knock at the door. The police had finally arrived. I let them in and quickly explained everything that had happened. They did a thorough search of the property, but found no signs of an intruder. The Martins got home shortly after, understandably freaked out. We were all talking with the police in the living room when I had a horrible realization. I hadn't checked on Sophie in at least 15 minutes. I raced to her room, the others right behind me. Sophie was still sleeping peacefully, thank God. But there, tucked into the corner of her crib, was a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. In crude, blocky letters it read, "Sweet dreams, little one. I'll be watching over you." The police went into overdrive then, dusting for prints, taking photos, searching for any clue of how someone could have gotten in and out undetected. They even brought in dogs to try and pick up a scent trail, but came up empty. As one of the officers was examining Sophie's window, He suddenly went very still. "Ms. Lauren," he said quietly, "come take a look at this." I approached cautiously. He pointed to a faint smudge on the outside of the glass. In the right light, you could just make out the outline of what looked like a face, as if someone had pressed their face against the window, watching us. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized this hadn't been some elaborate prank. Someone had actually been out there, stalking us all night long. The next few hours were a blur of police questions, comforting the distraught Martins, and trying to process my own fear and shock. They brought in extra patrols to monitor the neighborhood and set up a security system for the house. But despite all their efforts, they never found the guy. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. He seemed to have vanished into thin air. It's been months now, and sometimes I can almost convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or feel like I'm being watched when I'm alone at night, and I know that somewhere out there, he's still watching, still waiting. I don't babysit anymore. I'd volunteered to stay late to finish up some system updates that needed to be done after hours. It was tedious work, but I didn't mind. The solitude was kind of nice, and I always felt a sense of pride in being the dependable one who could handle these tasks. Around 10 p.m. I got up to stretch my legs and grab another cup of coffee from the break room. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I walked down the empty hallway. I remember thinking how eerie and abandoned the office felt at night, so different from the bustling energy of daytime. As I rounded the corner back towards my desk, coffee in hand, I nearly collided with a man I didn't recognize. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, and I let out a startled yelp, nearly spilling my drink. "Oh, I'm sorry," I stammered, heart racing from the surprise. "I didn't realize anyone else was still here." The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at me with an unsettling intensity. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and disheveled graying hair. His clothes were rumpled, and he had a wild, desperate look about him. "Where's Andy?" he finally asked in a low, raspy voice. "Andy, the security guard," I replied, confused. "I'm not sure. I haven't seen him tonight. Can I help you with something?" The man's eyes darted around nervously. "I need to talk to Andy. It's important." Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. Why would this stranger be looking for our night security guard at this hour? And how did he even get up to our floor? "I'm sorry, but the office is closed to visitors right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe you could come back during business hours tomorrow?" His expression darkened. "No, you don't understand. I have to see Andy tonight, right now." I took an instinctive step back, my palms starting to sweat. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a secure floor, and you shouldn't be up here." That's when he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. My blood ran cold. Time seemed to stop as I stared at the weapon, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in boring office buildings to ordinary people like me. "I'm not leaving until I talk to Andy," the man growled, his hand shaking slightly as he pointed the gun at me. "Now tell me where he is." I raised my hands slowly, the coffee cup slipping from my grasp and spilling across the carpet. "Please," I whispered. "I honestly don't know where Andy is. He usually walks the building. I haven't seen him all night." The man's eyes were wild, darting back and forth. He seemed agitated, unstable. I had no idea what he wanted with Andy, but I knew I was in serious danger. Okay, he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Change of plans, then. You're coming with me until Andy shows up." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Please, you don't have to do this," I pleaded. "I won't tell anyone. Just go and I'll forget this ever happened." But he wasn't listening. He roughly grabbed my arm and started dragging me down the hallway towards the conference rooms. I stumbled along, my legs feeling like jelly. "In here," he barked, shoving me through a doorway into one of the larger meeting rooms. "Sit down and don't move." I collapsed into one of the chairs, trembling uncontrollably. The man paced back and forth, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing out into the hallway. "What's your name?" he suddenly demanded. "J. Jack," I stammered, giving him the first name that popped into my head. "All right, Jack, here's what's going to happen," he said, pulling a handful of zip ties from his pocket. "I'm going to secure you to that chair. Then we wait for Andy. When he shows up, you're going to call him in here like everything's normal. Got it?" I nodded weakly, too terrified to speak. As he roughly bound my wrists and ankles to the chair, my mind raced. Who was this man? What did he want with Andy? And most pressingly, how the hell was I going to get out of this alive? The next hour was the longest of my life. The man alternated between pacing nervously and staring out the window, muttering to himself. I caught fragments about making things right and teaching them a lesson. I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible, not wanting to agitate him further. But inside, my mind was in overdrive. I thought about my family, my friends. Would I ever see them again? I couldn't believe that just a few hours ago, my biggest concern had been finishing those system updates. Suddenly, we both froze at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The man's head snapped towards the door, his grip tightening on the gun. "Remember what I said," he hissed at me. "Act normal, or I start shooting." The door handle turned, and I held my breath. This was it, the moment that would determine if I lived or died tonight. But it wasn't Andy who walked through that door. It was Melissa from accounting, who'd apparently also stayed late to finish up some work. She took 2 steps into the room before registering the scene before her. Me tied to a chair, a wild-eyed man pointing a gun. Her eyes went wide with shock, and she let out a terrified scream. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. The man lunged towards Melissa, but she'd already turned and bolted down the hallway. He hesitated for a split second, clearly torn about what to do. That moment of indecision was all it took. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway, and Andy's voice boomed out. "Hey, stop right there!" The man's face contorted with rage and fear. He looked from me to the door and back again, his hand shaking as he aimed the gun at my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain this was the end. But instead of a gunshot, I heard a string of curses followed by rapidly retreating footsteps. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. Seconds later, Andy burst into the room, his own weapon drawn. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently, rushing to untie me. What the hell happened here? I could only shake my head, still in shock. As Andy called the police and helped me to my feet, the reality of what I'd just survived began to sink in. The next few hours were a whirlwind of police statements and questions. They searched the building but found no trace of the gunman. Security footage showed him fleeing down the emergency stairs and disappearing into the snowy night. I learned later that he was a former employee who'd been fired months ago for erratic behavior. Apparently, he blamed Andy for his termination and had come seeking revenge. If Melissa hadn't happened to come by when she did, who knows how the night might have ended. It's been weeks now, but I still have nightmares about those terrifying hours. The office has beefed up security and implemented new safety protocols, but I can't shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingers. The knowledge that in an instant, an ordinary night at work can turn into a nightmare. I'm writing this now as a way to process what happened, I guess. And as a reminder to myself and others, you never know what dangers might be lurking, even in the most mundane places. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and never take your safety for granted. Because sometimes the monsters are real, and they can find you when you least expect it. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom as I made my way across the empty parking lot, my boots crunching in the snow. A bitter wind howled between the buildings, rattling loose metal and whipping snow into miniature cyclones. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face, my breath frosting in the air. As I approached the main factory building, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hesitated at the entrance, shining my light inside. Shadows danced across decrepit conveyor belts and idle robotic arms. Get a grip, I told myself. You've done this 100 times. It's just an empty building. I stepped inside, the metal door creaking shut behind me with a resounding clang that echoed through the cavernous space. My footsteps rang out as I began my usual circuit, checking doors and windows. The nighttime sounds of the factory were familiar, the groan of settling metal, the drip of leaking pipes, the skitter of rats in the walls. But then I heard something that didn't belong, a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. I froze, listening intently. It had to be my imagination, right? Or maybe just the wind playing tricks. But there it was again, a deep, guttural sound that was unmistakably animal. My heart began to race. What the hell kind of animal could be in here? A feral dog, maybe? A bear that had somehow wandered in? I swept my flashlight beam around frantically, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Two glowing eyes reflected in the darkness, eyes far too large to belong to any dog. As the massive shape emerged from the shadows, I felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a tiger, an enormous, fully grown tiger, padding silently across the factory floor. I blinked hard, certain I must be hallucinating. This was impossible. There was no conceivable way a tiger could be here in this abandoned factory in the middle of a Midwestern winter. But as it moved into the light, there was no denying the reality before me. Orange fur striped with black, rippling muscles beneath, massive paws that could crush bone, and those eyes fixed directly on me with predatory intent. For a moment, we just stared at each other. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. How? Why? None of it made any sense. Then survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the corridor, my boots pounding on the concrete. I could hear the tiger behind me, its claws scrabbling for purchase as it gave chase. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. I careened around a corner, nearly losing my footing. Where could I go? I knew the layout of the factory, but in my panic, everything was a confusing blur. I just ran blindly, driven by the primal urge to escape. The tiger was faster than me, I knew that. My only hope was to find somewhere to hide or to somehow get to higher ground. I spotted a metal staircase leading up to a catwalk and made a beeline for it. Taking the stairs two at a time, I raced upwards. The tiger snarled in frustration below, unable to follow. I allowed myself a moment of relief as I reached the catwalk, gasping for breath. But my reprieve was short-lived. With terrifying agility, the tiger leapt onto a nearby conveyor belt. Using it as a ramp, the massive cat bounded upwards, closing the distance between us. Cursing, I took off running again. The catwalk shuddered and swayed under my feet as I ran. I could hear the tiger's heavy footfalls right behind me, feel its hot breath on my heels. Up ahead, the catwalk split into two directions. I veered left without thinking, only to find myself at a dead end. My stomach dropped as I realized my mistake. I was trapped. I spun around to see the tiger advancing slowly, muscles coiled to pounce. Those piercing eyes bored into me. I was its prey, cornered with nowhere left to run. In desperation, I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. My light fell on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. I grabbed it, fumbling with numb fingers to pull the pin. The tiger crouched, ready to lunge. At that moment, I aimed the nozzle and squeezed the handle for all I was worth. A cloud of white foam erupted, blasting the big cat full in the face. It roared in surprise and confusion, momentarily blinded. I seized my chance and bolted past it, shoving the beast aside with all my strength as I ran. I practically flew down the catwalk, not daring to look back. I could hear the tiger's enraged roars echoing through the factory as it recovered and resumed the chase. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. There had to be somewhere I could go that the tiger couldn't follow, somewhere too small for its bulk. I spotted a partially open doorway up ahead that led to one of the administrative offices. If I could get inside and barricade the door, I might have a chance. I put on a final burst of speed, lunging for the door. I slammed it shut behind me just as the tiger crashed into it with bone-jarring force. The flimsy particle board buckled but held. Panting, I dragged a heavy metal desk in front of the door. The tiger hurled itself against it again and again, the impacts shuddering through my body. I piled on more furniture, anything I could find to reinforce my barricade. Finally, the assault on the door stopped. I heard snuffling sounds as the tiger circled, searching for another way in. But the windows were too small for it to fit through. For the moment, I was safe. I sank to the floor, my legs trembling too much to hold me up. What the hell was happening? How was any of this real? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, intending to call for help. But of course there was no signal. I was on my own. As my racing pulse began to slow, I tried to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe the tiger had escaped from a zoo or exotic animal sanctuary. But how would it have gotten all the way out here, miles from the nearest city? And why wasn't it more affected by the cold? Tigers weren't native to this climate. By all rights, it should be sluggish and lethargic in these frigid temperatures. But this one had moved with terrifying speed and agility. None of it made sense. It was like a waking nightmare. I don't know how long I huddled there in that office, straining my ears for any sound of the tiger's movements. Minutes stretched into hours. Occasionally, I would hear padding footsteps or a low growl that made my hair stand on end. The beast was still out there, prowling. As the night wore on, my terror began to give way to exhaustion. I fought to keep my eyes open, knowing that falling asleep could mean death. But despite my best efforts, I must have dozed off at some point. I jolted awake with a start, momentarily disoriented. Pale light was filtering in through the grimy windows. Morning had come. I listened intently, but heard nothing. Cautiously, I began to dismantle my barricade. I eased the door open a crack and peered out. The factory floor was empty and silent. No sign of the tiger anywhere. Still moving as quietly as possible, I crept out of the office and made my way through the building. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. If not for the lingering scent of the tiger's musk in the air, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I did a thorough search of every part of the complex I could access, but the tiger was gone without a trace. No tracks in the snow outside, no claw marks on the walls or floors, nothing. I drove home in a daze, barely able to process what had happened. In the light of day, it all seemed too fantastical to be real. But I knew what I had seen and experienced. The terror was still viscerally real. To this day, I have no explanation for what occurred that night. I never reported it. Who would believe such an insane story? I quit that job immediately and haven't set foot in that factory since. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a vivid nightmare or hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. For one inexplicable night, I was hunted by a ghost tiger in an abandoned factory, and I'll never understand why. Everything changed about 2 months ago. I was going through a rough patch. My wife of 20 years had just left me, and I was struggling to adjust to living alone. Work became my escape. I'd stay late, making sure every classroom was spotless, every hallway gleaming. It gave me something to focus on besides the emptiness waiting for me at home. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., did my usual rounds to make sure the building was empty, then got to work. I was in the cafeteria, scrubbing down tables, when I heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. I froze, straining my ears. It seemed to be coming from down the hall, near the kindergarten classrooms. My first thought was that some kids had snuck in somehow. It wouldn't be the first time. Bored teenagers were always trying to break in on weekends, but at this hour, and they sounded younger, like elementary age. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the sound. As I walked down the darkened hallway, the laughter faded away. I shone my light into each classroom, but they were all empty. Just as I was about to give up and chalk it up to my imagination, I noticed something on the floor. A set of small, wet footprints leading away from the water fountain. My heart started pounding. Those hadn't been there earlier when I'd mopped. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. The prints led to a storage closet at the end of the hall. I hesitated, then slowly reached for the doorknob. The closet was empty, just shelves of paper and art supplies. But as I turned to leave, my blood ran cold. There, on the back of the door, was a child's handprint, in what looked horribly like blood. I slammed the door shut and practically ran back to the cafeteria. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial my phone. I called my supervisor, told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. He grumbled, but said he'd send someone to cover the rest of my shift. I've never been so relieved in my life. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Still, I forced myself to go back the next night. I needed this job, especially now that I was on my own. I told myself it had been a one-time thing, that nothing would happen again. How wrong I was. The next few nights were quiet, almost eerily so. No more laughter, no more footprints. I started to relax, thinking maybe I really had imagined it all. Then came Friday night. I was in the gym, wheeling out the big dust mop, when the lights flickered, just for a second, but enough to make me jump. I looked up at the ancient fluorescence, wondering if we were in for a power outage. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the gym, half hidden in shadow, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. And wrong, somehow. Its proportions were off, limbs too long and oddly jointed. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, it was still there. My body went cold with fear. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The thing's head slowly turned towards me. That's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. It had no face, just smooth, featureless skin where eyes and mouth should be. A low, rattling sound filled the air. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the creature. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh, but something in between that made my skin crawl. It took a step towards me. Its movement was all wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. That broke my paralysis. I dropped the mop and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. I drove aimlessly for hours, too terrified to go home. Every shadow on the road looked like that thing, every streetlight like its eyeless face. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. On Monday, I went in and quit. Told them I'd found another job closer to home. My supervisor seemed surprised. I'd always been reliable before, but he wished me well. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the memory of what I saw in that gym. I've got a new job at a warehouse across town. The pay's not as good, but at least it's never empty. There's always people around, machines running. No chance of being alone in the dark with whatever that was. I drive past Pine Hill sometimes on my way to work. It looks so normal in the daylight, with kids playing on the swings and teachers standing watch. But I know what lurks there after dark, and I pray that whoever took my place as night janitor never has to see it for themselves. I don't know what that thing was, or why it appeared to me. Was it some kind of ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, something our human minds can't even comprehend? All I know is that it was real, and that the memory of its faceless head turning towards me will haunt me for the rest of my days. Sometimes I wonder if I should have told someone, warned the school, or called in paranormal investigators or something. But who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs, and part of me is terrified that talking about it might somehow make it real again, might draw its attention back to me. So I keep quiet. I go to work, I come home, I try to rebuild my life. But every night, as I lie in bed staring at the shadows on my ceiling, I can't help but wonder, is it still there, stalking the dark halls of Pine Hill Elementary? And who will be its next victim? I guess I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left in the dark, where they belong. But if you're ever alone in an empty building late at night, and you hear something that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the shadows. There was a gap between the back of the shelf and the wall, just big enough to see through. I'd never noticed it before. Curious, I pulled the shelf away from the wall, revealing a small space behind it. And there, tucked away in the darkness, was a cardboard box. My first thought was that it must be old inventory that had fallen back there and been forgotten. But as I reached for it, a chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. The box was sealed with duct tape, covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like it had been there for years. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my box cutter and sliced through the tape. As I opened the flaps, the musty smell hit me first. Then I saw movement inside. Before I could process what was happening, rats started pouring out of the box. I'm not talking about a couple of mice. I mean dozens, maybe hundreds of rats, streaming out in a furry avalanche. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display of chips as rats scattered in every direction. They were everywhere, scurrying across the floor, climbing the shelves, even dropping from the ceiling tiles. In a panic, I ran for the front door, fumbling with my keys. But as I reached for the lock, I froze. If I let these rats escape into the street, I'd be responsible for a full-blown infestation in the neighborhood. I couldn't do that. Heart pounding, I turned back to face the chaos. The store was alive with movement, shelves rattling as rats climbed them. I could hear things falling and breaking all around me. This was a nightmare. I grabbed a broom from the storage closet and started swinging, trying to herd the rats back toward the stockroom. It was useless. There were too many, and they were too fast. Every time I managed to corral a few, more would appear from some hidden corner. As I chased them around, questions raced through my mind. Where did these rats come from? How long had they been in that box? And who the hell had put them there? I spent the next few hours in a blur of rat chasing and frantic cleaning. I managed to trap some in empty boxes and cornered others in the stockroom, but many disappeared into the walls or escaped through gaps I didn't even know existed. By the time my manager arrived at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and covered in sweat and rat droppings. The store was a disaster zone. Half the inventory was destroyed. There were rat droppings everywhere, and I could still hear scurrying in the walls. I tried to explain what had happened, but it sounded insane even to my own ears. A box full of rats hidden behind a shelf? My manager looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He probably thought I'd gotten high and trashed the place myself. As we started the massive cleanup, I kept thinking about that box. Why would someone seal hundreds of live rats in a box and hide it in a convenience store? It didn't make any sense. We spent the whole day cleaning, throwing out contaminated products and laying traps. An exterminator came and set up more traps and poison stations. But even after all that, we kept finding signs of rats, droppings, chewed packages, glimpses of tails disappearing around corners. It was like they were mocking us, always one step ahead. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Every shadow, every small sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As we were finishing up for the day, I was moving a shelving unit to check behind it. That's when I saw something glint in the fluorescent light. I reached down and picked up a small silver bracelet. It was tarnished and covered in dust, but I could just make out a name engraved on it. Emma. A chill ran through me. This bracelet must have been hidden with that box of rats. But why? Who was Emma? And what did she have to do with this? I showed the bracelet to my manager, but he just shrugged it off. He was more concerned about getting the store back in order, but I couldn't let it go. This was evidence that something seriously weird was going on. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw rats pouring out of that box. I kept wondering about Emma. Was she somehow connected to the rats? Was she in danger? Or was she responsible for this somehow? The next day, I went back to work, half expecting, or maybe hoping, that it had all been a bizarre dream. But the evidence was everywhere. Empty traps, more rat droppings, chewed wires. The rats were still there, hiding in the walls and ceiling. I became obsessed with finding answers. I searched online for any local news about missing persons named Emma, or strange incidents involving rats. I asked around the neighborhood if anyone knew an Emma who might be connected to the store, but I came up empty. As the days passed, the rat problem seemed to get worse, not better. No matter how many we caught or poisoned, there always seemed to be more. Customers started to complain about the smell, and sales dropped off. My manager was on edge, snapping at everyone. I started to notice other strange things too. Sometimes I'd hear whispering when I was alone in the store, but it would stop as soon as I tried to locate the source. Items would move on their own when my back was turned. More than once, I could have sworn I saw a figure darting just out of sight. About a week after finding the box, I was closing up alone. As I was locking the front door, I heard a crash from the back of the store. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding. There, standing in the middle of aisle 3, was a young girl. She was pale and thin, with long matted hair. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, she raised her arm. On her wrist was a silver bracelet, identical to the one I'd found. She pointed at me, her eyes wide and accusing. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I ran to where she had been standing, but there was no sign of her, just a few rat droppings on the floor. I searched the entire store, but she had vanished as quickly as she had appeared. That was the last straw for me. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't handle it anymore. The rats, the whispers, the ghostly girl. It was too much. It's been months now, and I still don't have any answers. I drive by Pete's corner store sometimes, and it looks normal from the outside. But I know the truth. I know about the rats in the walls, the hidden box, and the girl named Emma. I don't know if what I experienced was supernatural, or if there's some rational explanation I'm missing. All I know is that I uncovered something that day, something dark and unexplainable. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scurrying of rats in my walls, even though I know it's impossible. I'm sharing this story because I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Has anyone else seen the girl with the silver bracelet? Does anyone know what really happened at Pete's corner store? Because I'm starting to think that what I uncovered goes far beyond a simple rat infestation. I'm afraid I've stumbled onto something much bigger and much more sinister, and I don't know what to do about it. As I wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening, the bell above the door chimed. I looked up to see a man I didn't recognize walk in. He was tall, probably around 6'4", with broad shoulders and a stern expression that made me feel uneasy. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. "Good evening. Welcome to Maple Hollow," I greeted him with my usual cheerful tone. "What can I get for you tonight?" He approached the counter slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something unsettling about his gaze, like he was looking through me rather than at me. "Black coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded and turned to prepare his drink, feeling his eyes on my back the entire time. When I handed him the cup, our fingers brushed, and I couldn't help but notice how cold his hands were. It sent a shiver down my spine. "That'll be $2.50, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He placed a $5 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he muttered, then made his way to a table in the far corner of the cafe. For the next hour, I busied myself with cleaning and restocking, all the while acutely aware of his presence. Every time I glanced in his direction, he was staring at me, his coffee seemingly untouched. The few other customers who came in during this time left quickly, as if they too could sense the strange atmosphere. As the clock struck 10 p.m., I began the closing procedures. The man still hadn't moved from his spot. I approached his table cautiously. "Excuse me, sir. We'll be closing in about 15 minutes, I informed him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. He looked up at me, a small smile playing on his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "It must be lonely working here all by yourself at night," he said, ignoring my statement completely. I felt my heart rate quicken. "Oh, not really. We get a decent amount of customers," I lied, trying to sound nonchalant. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "But right now, it's just you and me, isn't it?" I took a step back, my hands shaking slightly. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. We're closing. He stood up slowly, towering over me. Of course. Wouldn't want to keep you here any longer than necessary. He paused, then added, You know, I've been watching you for a while now. You're always so friendly, so trusting. It's endearing. My blood ran cold. Had he been stalking me? I tried to keep my voice firm as I said, Please leave now, or I'll have to call the police. He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. No need for that. I'm going. He walked towards the door, then turned back to me. See you soon, sweetheart. As soon as he left, I rushed to lock the door behind him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. Through the glass, I could see him standing on the sidewalk, lighting a cigarette. He took a long drag, exhaled slowly, and then looked directly at me. He winked, then started walking away. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As I waited for someone to pick up, I kept my eyes fixed on the man's retreating figure. But just as the operator answered, something impossible happened. The man vanished. 1 second he was there, walking down the dimly lit street, and the next, he was gone. There was no alley he could have turned into, no doorway he could have entered. He simply disappeared into thin air. I blinked hard, convinced I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, all that remained was the faint glow of his cigarette on the sidewalk, a thin trail of smoke rising from it. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice snapped me back to reality. I stuttered out an explanation, my eyes never leaving that smoking cigarette on the ground. The police arrived within minutes, but of course there was no sign of the man. They took my statement, looked at our security footage, which showed the man entering and leaving, but mysteriously glitched during his time inside the cafe, and advised me not to work alone at night anymore. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed my shifts, asked for more security measures at the cafe, and even considered quitting my job. But life went on, and slowly, the incident began to feel more like a bad dream than a real memory. That is, until exactly 1 week later. I was closing up the cafe again, this time with a coworker. As I was wiping down the last table, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There, on the far corner table, the same one the man had sat at, was a steaming cup of black coffee. My coworker swore she hadn't served anyone in the last hour, and I certainly hadn't either. We checked the security cameras, but once again, they showed nothing but static for the past hour. I don't work at Maple Hollow anymore. I couldn't bear the constant fear, the feeling of eyes on me even when I was alone. Sometimes, when I walk past the cafe, I swear I can smell cigarette smoke and coffee. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a tall figure in the window, watching me as I hurry past. I don't know who or what that man was. I don't know why he chose me or what he wanted. But I do know that I'll never forget that night, or the chill that runs down my spine every time I think about his words. See you soon, sweetheart. I hope I never do. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway near the packaging area. At first I didn't think much of it, probably just Jim from maintenance doing his rounds. But then I realized Jim wasn't scheduled that night. I got up from my station to investigate, my heart starting to race a bit. As I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure in a dark hoodie at the far end of the corridor. They were just standing there, motionless, facing away from me. "Hey!" I called out. "This area's restricted. Who are you?" The figure didn't respond or move. I took a few steps closer, my palms starting to sweat. I said, "Who are you? You can't be in here." Suddenly, the hooded person turned their head, just their head, not their body, and looked right at me. I couldn't make out a face in the shadows of the hood, but I felt their gaze lock onto mine. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could say anything else, they took off running down the hall. I sprinted after them, shouting for them to stop, but when I rounded the corner, they were gone, vanished into thin air. My heart was pounding as I pulled out my radio to call security. I described what happened, and they said they'd do a sweep of the building. I went back to my station, jumpy and on edge. About 20 minutes later, my supervisor radioed to say they hadn't found anyone. The building was clear, and all doors were still locked. I tried to calm myself down, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Lack of sleep playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. This time, I saw the hooded figure dart across an intersection of hallways about 50 feet ahead of me. Just a quick flash of movement. I radioed it in immediately and took off in that direction. As I ran down the hall, the overhead lights started flickering ominously. The air felt heavy and oppressive. When I got to where I'd seen the figure, there was nothing there, but a door to one of the storage rooms was slightly ajar. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open. The room was pitch black inside. I fumbled for the light switch, my breath coming in short gasps. When the fluorescent lights flickered on, I nearly screamed. Standing in the center of the room was the hooded figure, completely motionless. This time I could see gloved hands peeking out from the sleeves. But where the face should have been was just darkness, an inky void. I stumbled backwards out of the room, slamming the door shut. I sprinted down the hall in a panic, shouting into my radio for help. Security came running, and we returned to the storage room less than 2 minutes later. But the room was empty. No sign anyone had been there. My supervisor arrived, and I frantically tried to explain what was happening. He looked concerned and suggested I take a break to calm down. Security did another sweep, but found nothing. I sat in the break room with my head in my hands, questioning my sanity. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, but it had felt so real. After about 30 minutes, I gathered myself and went back to work. I told myself I was just overtired and seeing things. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. As my shift ended and the sun began to rise, I started to feel silly about the whole thing. Probably just my imagination running wild in the dark, empty factory. I clocked out and headed to my car in the parking lot, eager to get home and forget about the weird night. But as I approached my beat-up Honda Civic, I noticed something odd on the driver's seat. There, sitting in the middle of the seat, was a single rusted bolt. My blood ran cold. I was positive I'd locked my car. How did that get there? With trembling hands, I picked up the bolt. It was old and corroded, unlike anything used in the modern halcyon factory. As I turned it over in my palm, I noticed tiny symbols or letters etched into the metal. They looked ancient, like no language I'd ever seen. I dropped the bolt like it was on fire and scrambled into my car, peeling out of the parking lot as fast as I could. My mind was reeling. When I got home, I immediately checked the security footage from my shift. But to my horror, I found that all the cameras had mysteriously cut out from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., exactly when all the weird stuff was happening. It's been 3 days now, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I keep seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I hear whispers just on the edge of hearing. I don't know what happened that night at Halcyon Factory, but I know it was real. Something was there, something not human, and I have a terrible feeling it's not finished with me yet. I've called in sick the past couple days, too scared to go back, but I can't avoid it forever. My shift starts in an hour, and I'm sitting here staring at my car keys, trying to work up the courage to return. What if it's there waiting for me? What if this time it doesn't disappear? I don't know what to do. I can't explain what happened, but I know deep in my bones that it was real. That hooded figure, the bolt in my car, it all means something. Something terrifying that I can't even begin to comprehend. If anyone has experienced anything similar or has any ideas what this could be, please let me know. I'm desperate for answers, and I'm afraid of what might happen if I go back to that factory tonight. I keep telling myself it'll be fine. Security has been alerted, they'll be on high alert. But then I remember how easily that thing evaded them before, how it seemed to appear and disappear at will. My hands are shaking as I type this. In 45 minutes I have to leave for my shift. Part of me wants to just quit, to never step foot in that place again. But I need this job. And another part of me needs to know the truth. What was that thing? Why did it single me out? What do the symbols on that bolt mean? I feel like I'm losing my mind, like I've stumbled into something I was never meant to see, a hidden world just beneath the surface of our reality. I don't know if I'll make it through another night at Halcyon. If something happens to me, at least I've shared my story here. Maybe it will help someone else who encounters this thing. Wish me luck. I'm going to need it. Word count, 128. I'm heading out to my car now, steeling myself for the drive to Halcyon. The bolt is still sitting on my kitchen counter where I left it. I'm tempted to bring it with me, but something tells me that would be a mistake. The drive to the factory feels surreal, like I'm moving through a dream. Every shadow on the road makes me flinch. Twice I think I see a hooded figure standing on the side of the road, but it's gone when I look again. As I pull into the parking lot, my hands are slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The factory looms before me, windows dark and empty. For a moment I consider turning around and driving away, but I force myself to get out of the car. The night air is unseasonably cold. An odd mist has settled over the grounds, reducing visibility. I hurry towards the employee entrance, fumbling with my keycard. Just as I'm about to swipe in, I freeze. There, reflected in the glass door, is a hooded figure standing right behind me. I whirl around with a strangled cry, but there's no one there, just empty fog swirling in the parking lot. My heart is thundering in my chest as I practically run inside, slamming the door behind me. I lean against it, trying to catch my breath. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I nearly jump out of my skin at the voice. It's just Mike, the security guard, giving me an odd look. Yeah, I'm fine," I stammer. "Just a little jumpy, I guess." Mike nods slowly. "I heard about what happened the other night. Don't worry, we've got extra patrols on. Nothing's getting in here without us knowing about it." I try to smile, but it feels more like a grimace. If only he knew. The first few hours of my shift pass uneventfully. I keep glancing over my shoulder, starting at every little noise, but nothing out of the ordinary happens. Around 1 a.m., I start to relax a little. Maybe it really was all in my head. Maybe. A loud clang echoes through the factory, making me jump. It sounded like it came from the loading docks. I grab my radio with shaking hands. "Security, did you hear that?" Static, then Mike's voice. "Negative. What did you hear?" "A loud bang from the loading area. Can you check it out?" 10-4, on my way. I wait anxiously by my station, straining my ears for any further sounds. After a few tense minutes, Mike radios back. "All clear down here. Probably just some equipment settling." I let out a shaky breath. Just my nerves getting the better of me again. But then I see it. Just a flicker of movement at the end of the hall. A shadow passing by too quickly to be natural. My mouth goes dry. Mike, can you come up to the packaging area? I think I saw something. No response, just crackling static. Mike, anyone copy? Nothing. With trembling legs, I make my way towards where I saw the movement. Every instinct is screaming at me to run, but I have to know. As I turn the corner, my blood runs cold. There, spray painted on the wall in dripping black letters, is a message. The bolt is the key. I stumble backwards, my mind reeling. How? When? A hand clamps down on my shoulder and I let out a scream. It's Mike, looking alarmed. Whoa, easy there. What's going on? I point wordlessly at the wall, but when I look back, the message is gone. Just a blank white wall. Mike is staring at me with growing concern. Maybe you should go home, get some rest. You don't look so good. I open my mouth to argue, to insist what I saw was real. But then I see it again. The hooded figure standing at the far end of the hall behind Mike, staring right at me. I blink and it's gone. What's happening to me? The rest of the night passes in a haze. I'm barely functional, jumping at shadows. When my shift finally ends, I practically run to my car. As I pull out of the parking lot, movement in my rearview mirror catches my eye. My heart stops. The hooded figure is standing in the middle of the road behind me, growing smaller as I drive away. I floor it, tires squealing as I race home. I don't slow down until I'm safely inside my apartment, door locked behind me. My eyes are immediately drawn to the kitchen counter. The bolt is gone. In its place is a small piece of paper. With shaking hands, I unfold it to find a message written in the same ancient script as the bolt. We'll be waiting. I don't know what to do. I don't know what any of this means. But I know I can never go back to Halcyon Factory again. Whatever is happening, whatever that thing is, it's not over. This is just the beginning. If anyone out there has any idea what I'm dealing with, please help. I'm terrified of what comes next. Final word count, 1982. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. I looked up to see two women walk in, both dressed in long skirts and button-up blouses despite the summer heat. They appeared to be in their 40s or 50s, with identical tight buns pulling their hair back severely from their faces. Something about their appearance immediately set me on edge, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Good evening," I greeted them politely. "Let me know if you need any help finding anything." The women ignored my greeting, instead making a beeline straight for the counter. They stood side by side, staring at me with unnervingly intense expressions. "We're not here to shop," the taller one said. "We're here for you." A chill ran down my spine. "Excuse me?" "We've been watching you," the other woman chimed in. Her voice was oddly melodic, almost hypnotic. "We know you're lost. We're here to help you find your way." I forced a polite smile, though my heart was starting to race. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not lost. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, at work." The first woman shook her head slowly. "No, child, you're so very lost. But don't worry. We can save you." They were beginning to seriously creep me out. I glanced at the clock, dismayed to see it was only 2:07 a.m., nearly 5 hours left in my shift, trapped here with these weirdos. "Look, I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," I said firmly. "If you're not here to make a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The women exchanged a knowing look. "We're not selling anything," the melodic-voiced one said. "We're offering you the greatest gift of all, salvation." Great. Religious nut jobs. Just what I needed in the middle of the night. "Thanks, but I'm good," I replied. Like I said, if you're not buying anything, you need to go. The taller woman's face hardened. You don't understand. This isn't a coincidence. We were sent here specifically for you. You need us. A tendril of fear wormed its way into my gut. How did they know I'd be working tonight? Had they really been watching me? I tried to keep my voice steady. I don't need anything from you. Please leave now before I call the police. The police can't save you, the other woman said, her hypnotic voice taking on a sharper edge. Only we can do that. My hand inched towards the panic button under the counter. Save me from what exactly? From yourself, the tall one replied. From the darkness inside you. We can see it, you know. The sin, the doubt, the fear. I swallowed hard. I have no idea what you're talking about. You need to leave. Now. Instead of complying, they began to slowly walk around opposite ends of the counter, moving to flank me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Don't be afraid, the melodic one crooned. We're here to help you, to cleanse you. Stay back, I shouted, fumbling for the panic button. I'm warning you. They kept advancing, their faces masks of benevolent concern that didn't reach their cold eyes. You can't run from salvation, the tall one intoned. It's your destiny, your purpose. Just as I finally managed to press the panic button, the power cut out. The store was plunged into darkness, lit only by the dim glow of the emergency lights. I yelped in surprise and fear. What did you do? I demanded, my voice shaking. How did you do that? Their voices came from the darkness, seeming to surround me. We didn't do anything. It's a sign, a message. It's time for you to see the light. I groped blindly for my cell phone, desperate to call 911. But when I pulled it out, the screen was black. Dead, despite having been fully charged when my shift started. This isn't happening, I muttered. This can't be real. Oh, it's very real, the melodic voice whispered, terrifyingly close to my ear. I jerked away, banging into the shelves behind the counter. You can't escape your fate, the other voice added from my other side. You were chosen, special. I ducked down, crawling along the floor behind the counter. Maybe if I could make it to the stockroom, I could barricade myself in until help arrived. Surely someone would respond to the panic button soon. As I inched along, I felt a hand brush my ankle. I kicked out reflexively, hearing a grunt of pain as I connected with something solid. Now, the tall woman chided. There's no need for violence. We're here to help you. I don't want your help, I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Leave me alone. I made a break for the stockroom door, but a strong hand caught my arm, yanking me back. I screamed, thrashing wildly. Shh, the melodic voice soothed. Don't fight it. Let the light in. I managed to wrench free, stumbling forward. My hips slammed into the corner of the counter, sending pain shooting through my side. But I didn't stop. I ran for the front door, praying it wasn't locked. To my immense relief, it opened when I pushed. I burst out into the warm night air, gasping for breath. The parking lot was deserted, no sign of any customers or passers-by who might help. I sprinted towards my car, fumbling for my keys. Behind me, I heard the store door open again. You can't run from your destiny, one of the women called after me. We'll find you again. We'll always find you. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and hitting the lock button repeatedly. As I jammed the key into the ignition, I looked up to see the two women standing just outside the store. They were perfectly still, watching me with those unsettling smiles. I cranked the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. I drove aimlessly for hours, too afraid to go home in case they followed me. When the sun finally rose, I parked in a busy shopping center lot and broke down sobbing. It's been 3 days since that night. I quit my job at the convenience store, obviously. I've been staying with a friend, too scared to go back to my apartment. I don't know who those women were or what they really wanted with me. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. A hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. But the bruise on my hip from where I hit the counter is all too real. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly terrible that night. Something dark and dangerous masquerading as salvation. I'm jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I see a woman with her hair in a bun, my heart starts racing. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid to go to the police. What would I even tell them? I have no proof of anything, and some irrational part of me is terrified that if I start talking about it, those women will find out somehow, that they'll come for me again. All I know is that I'm never working another night shift as long as I live. And I'll always wonder if they were right about one thing, that they'll find me again someday. I pray they were wrong, but deep down, I'm not so sure. I was an avid hiker, always seeking out new trails and unexplored wilderness. That day started like any other. I packed my gear, laced up my boots, and headed out at dawn for a long trek through a remote forest I'd never visited before. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air, golden sunlight filtering through the colorful leaves. I felt alive and at peace as I made my way deeper into the woods. After several hours of hiking, I noticed the trail was becoming overgrown and harder to follow. I checked my map and realized I must have veered off course at some point. As I was trying to get my bearings, I spotted something through the trees that made me pause, what looked like the edge of a wooden structure. Curious, I made my way towards it. As I got closer, I saw it was an old cabin, weathered and dilapidated. It seemed to have been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. Vines and moss crept up the walls, and part of the roof had caved in. I knew I should probably keep moving and try to find my way back to the trail, but something about the cabin drew me in. I had to take a closer look. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light coming through the broken windows. It was a simple one-room cabin with rotting furniture and debris strewn about. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I noticed a trap door in the floor. My heartbeat quickened. What could be down there? Against my better judgment, I lifted the heavy wooden door. A musty smell wafted up from the darkness below. I switched on my headlamp and carefully made my way down the rickety stairs into a low-ceilinged basement. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a crude stone altar, stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. Surrounding it were strange symbols carved into the dirt floor and walls. Bits of bone and feathers were scattered around. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if some malevolent presence was watching me. I knew I needed to get out of there immediately. As I turned to flee up the stairs, movement in the shadows caught my eye. A figure was emerging from the darkness. A man, but unlike any I'd ever seen. His skin was pale and waxy, eyes sunken and glassy. He moved in a jerky, unnatural way. A guttural sound emerged from his throat. Panic exploded in my chest. I scrambled up the stairs as fast as I could, hearing shuffling footsteps behind me. I burst out of the cabin and took off running through the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear something pursuing me, that awful growling noise growing closer. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, lungs burning, legs aching. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds faded and I slowed to a stop, gasping for air. The forest was silent except for my ragged breathing. As my panic subsided, doubt began to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe my imagination had run wild in that creepy old cabin. But deep down, I knew the horror had been real. I made my way back to civilization in a daze. To this day, I can't explain what I encountered in those woods. I've never returned to that forest, and I probably never will. But sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, that inhuman growl echoing in my mind. Whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't natural. And I fear it's still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to stumble upon its lair. I know it sounds crazy. Most people probably won't believe me. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That cabin held some kind of ancient evil. I consider myself lucky to have escaped with my life. If you're ever hiking in remote woods and come across an abandoned cabin, my advice is to keep walking and don't look back. You never know what horrors might be lurking inside. The experience shook me to my core. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house at night made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no logical explanation. I did some research, trying to find any information about that area of forest or reports of similar encounters, but I came up empty. It seems I may have been the only one to stumble upon that nightmarish scene. Part of me is glad for that. I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone else, but it also means I have no way to validate my experience or get closure. Sometimes I wonder if I should report what happened to the authorities. But what would I even say? I have no proof, and I'm not entirely sure I could find that spot again, even if I wanted to. And honestly, I'm afraid of being labeled as crazy or unstable if I told the full story. So I've kept it to myself until now. Sharing it anonymously like this is cathartic in a way. Even if no one believes me, at least I've finally let it out. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience and will reach out. Or maybe this will serve as a warning to other hikers to be cautious in unfamiliar territory. I still love nature and the outdoors. I haven't given up hiking completely, but I'm much more wary now, especially in remote areas. I stick to well-traveled trails and always let someone know where I'm going. And I never ever explore abandoned structures I come across, no matter how intriguing they might seem. The rational part of my brain tries to come up with explanations for what I saw that day. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax or the hideout of some backwoods cult. Maybe I was dehydrated and hallucinating. But in my heart, I know it was something far more sinister and otherworldly. There are things in this world that defy explanation, dark forces beyond our understanding. I got a glimpse behind the veil that day, and it nearly cost me everything. So take it from me. Be careful out there in the wilderness. Respect nature, but also be aware that not everything you encounter may be natural. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still get chills thinking about that guttural growl and those glassy, lifeless eyes emerging from the shadows. It's an image that will haunt me for the rest of my days. I count myself lucky to have escaped, and I hope I never encounter anything like it again. But a part of me will always wonder, what exactly was in that cabin? And is it still there, waiting for its next victim? All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places are better left unexplored, some doors better left unopened. I learned that lesson the hard way. So be careful out there, fellow hikers. And if you ever come across a mysterious cabin deep in the forest, just keep walking. Trust me, You don't want to know what's inside. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've always considered myself a rational, level-headed person, but now I find myself more open to the possibility of the supernatural. I'm more attuned to the energy of places, the whispers on the wind. It's like that encounter opened up a part of my mind that was previously closed off. I've had some strange occurrences since then. Nothing as dramatic as the cabin, but little things that make me wonder. Objects moving on their own, shadows in the corner of my eye, vivid dreams that feel more like memories. Maybe I'm just more aware of these things now, or maybe that brush with the unknown left some kind of mark on me. I've thought about seeking out others who have had paranormal experiences, but I'm hesitant. Part of me wants answers, wants to understand what happened to me, but another part is afraid of delving too deep into that world. What if there are things out there that, once acknowledged, can't be ignored? What if learning more only opens me up to more danger? For now, I'm trying to find a balance. I still enjoy the outdoors, still find peace in nature, but I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I pay attention to my instincts, that gut feeling that tells you something isn't right. It's served me well so far. I often wonder about that pale, otherworldly figure I saw in the basement. Was it human once? Some poor soul trapped by whatever dark forces resided in that cabin? Or was it something that was never human to begin with? The questions haunt me, but I know I'll probably never get answers. Sometimes I think I catch a whiff of that musty basement smell, or hear a faint echo of that growl. It's probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but it never fails to send a shiver down my spine. The trauma of that day is something I'll carry with me always. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help others be more aware and cautious. Not to the point of paranoia, but just to be mindful that there are things in this world we don't understand. Trust your instincts, respect the unknown, and be careful out there. You never know what you might encounter in the wild places of the world. As for me, I'll keep hiking, keep exploring, but I'll always be looking over my shoulder, always listening for that growl. And I'll never forget the terror of that day in the woods, when I came face to face with something beyond explanation. It's a reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, and that some secrets are better left undiscovered. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what I thought would be a day-long trek through the Alps. The air was cool and fresh, and the views were absolutely breathtaking. Towering peaks stretched as far as the eye could see, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the early morning sun. I felt alive and invigorated as I made my way along the well-worn trail, my backpack bouncing slightly with each step. For the first few hours, everything was going perfectly. I stopped occasionally to snap photos of the incredible scenery or to take sips from my water bottle. The trail wound its way steadily upwards, sometimes quite steeply, but I felt strong and capable. I passed a few other hikers along the way, exchanging friendly nods and hellos in various languages. It wasn't until early afternoon that I realized something was wrong. The trail had become less and less defined, until I found myself picking my way through dense underbrush with no clear path in sight. At first, I wasn't too concerned. I figured I must have just wandered off the main trail momentarily, and that if I backtracked a bit, I'd find it again easily enough. But as I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all blended together, an endless sea of green and brown. My heart started to beat a little faster as I spun in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. Which way had I come from? Where was the trail? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I knew panicking wouldn't help. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS to navigate back to the trail. But of course, there was no signal this far up in the mountains. I cursed under my breath, shoving the useless device back in my pocket. Okay, I thought, don't freak out. Just pick a direction and start walking. You're bound to hit a trail or a road eventually. So that's what I did. I chose what seemed like the most promising direction and started hiking, pushing my way through thick vegetation. But as the minutes turned to hours, I saw no sign of any trail or path. The forest seemed to press in around me, the trees growing denser and taller. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel the first stirrings of real fear. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached. I hadn't packed for an overnight stay in the wilderness. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, barely any food left, and I was utterly, hopelessly lost. I tried calling out for help, my voice echoing eerily through the silent forest. But there was no response, just the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snapping of a twig beneath my feet. As dusk began to fall, turning the forest into a maze of lengthening shadows, real panic set in. I was no longer walking calmly, but stumbling frantically through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I pushed blindly forward, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. In the growing darkness, every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the bushes made me flinch. My imagination ran wild, conjuring images of wolves, bears, or worse things lurking just out of sight. I felt watched, as if some malevolent presence was stalking me through the gloom. Night fell completely, plunging the forest into inky blackness. I had a small flashlight, but its beam seemed pitiful against the vast darkness. I huddled at the base of a large tree, shivering violently. I was exhausted, but too scared to sleep. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me start in terror. As the long, cold hours of the night dragged on, I began to lose hope. Would anyone even realize I was missing? Would they be able to find me in this vast wilderness? I thought of my family back home, of all the things I still wanted to do with my life. Tears streamed down my face as I contemplated the very real possibility that I might die alone out here in these mountains. In my fear and desperation, my mind began to play tricks on me. I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind, saw flitting shapes darting between the trees just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Was it just my imagination, or was there really something out there watching me? At one point, I heard what sounded like distant laughter echoing through the trees. My blood ran cold. It didn't sound human. I curled into a tight ball, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't find me. As the sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, I was nearly delirious with fear and exhaustion. I hadn't slept at all, jumping at every sound, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. With the growing light, I forced myself to my feet. My whole body ached, and I was shaking with cold and hunger. But I knew I had to keep moving. I picked a direction at random and started walking, my legs wobbly beneath me. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to blur together, each step a monumental effort. I was so focused on just putting one foot in front of the other that I almost didn't register the sound at first. Voices, human voices. I froze, straining my ears. Yes, there it was again. The faint sound of people talking, coming from somewhere off to my right. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and cracking. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? I need help." I started moving towards the sound, shouting as loudly as I could. "Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" Suddenly, I heard a shout in response. "Hello? Is someone there?" I nearly wept with relief. Yes, I'm here. I'm lost. Please help me." A few moments later, 2 hikers emerged from the trees. They looked shocked to see me, and I can only imagine what a sight I must have been, scratched and dirty, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, hurrying towards me. "What happened?" I tried to explain, but I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I could barely get the words out. I just kept repeating, "I got lost. I've been lost all night. I thought I was going to die out here." The hikers were incredibly kind. They gave me water and some of their food, and used their satellite phone to call for help. They stayed with me until a rescue team arrived to guide us all back to safety. As we hiked back to civilization, I was flooded with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and lingering fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed up against something out there in those dark woods, something ancient and unknowable. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about being lost in those mountains. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, half convinced I can still hear those eerie whispers and laughter echoing through the trees. I know I was incredibly lucky. If those hikers hadn't found me when they did, I might not have made it out of there alive. The experience has left me with a profound respect for the power of nature, and a keen awareness of just how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness. I still love hiking and the outdoors, but now I'm much more cautious. I always make sure someone knows where I'm going and when I'll be back. I carry emergency supplies and a satellite phone, and I never, ever stray from the marked trails, because I know firsthand how easy it is to get lost out there, and I never want to experience that bone-deep terror again, that feeling of being utterly alone in the vast, uncaring wilderness, with unknown things lurking in the shadows. I've been a journalist for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered deep in those woods last month. It all started when I began investigating a series of mysterious disappearances in the area. People had been vanishing without a trace. Hikers, campers, even a few locals who lived on the outskirts of town. The police seemed to have no leads, so I decided to do some digging on my own. After weeks of research and interviews, I finally got a tip that pointed me towards an isolated stretch of forest, about 50 miles outside of town. My source, an elderly man who lived nearby, told me he'd seen strange lights and heard chanting coming from deep in the woods late at night. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first real lead I'd gotten. I set out early one morning, my backpack loaded with supplies, camera equipment, and a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The drive took me down winding back roads until I reached a small dirt parking area at the edge of the forest. As I stepped out of my car, I was struck by how quiet and still everything was. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook off the uneasy feeling and started down the narrow hiking trail, pushing deeper into the dense woods. The further I went, the darker it got as the thick canopy of trees blocked out most of the sunlight. After a few hours of hiking, I was starting to think I'd hit another dead end. But then I heard something that made me freeze in my tracks, the faint sound of voices in the distance. My journalistic instincts kicked in, and I moved as quietly as I could towards the source of the noise. As I got closer, I could make out what sounded like chanting in some kind of strange language I didn't recognize. My heart was pounding as I crept forward, using the trees and undergrowth for cover. Finally, I reached the edge of a large clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. There was a group of about 20 people gathered in a circle, all wearing tattered robes that looked like they were made from burlap sacks. In the center was a crude stone altar, and on top of it was something. I couldn't quite make it out from where I was crouched, but it looked like some kind of small animal, maybe a rabbit or squirrel. The chanting grew louder and more frenzied. One of the robed figures stepped forward holding a jagged stone knife. With horror, I realized they were about to sacrifice the animal as part of some twisted ritual. I knew I needed to document this, so I slowly raised my camera and zoomed in, trying to steady my shaking hands. Just as I was about to snap a photo, my finger slipped and hit the flash button. A bright light flashed across the clearing, and 20 pairs of eyes suddenly turned in my direction. For a moment, everything was silent and still. Then chaos erupted. The cultists started shrieking and pointing towards me. Their leader bellowed something in that strange language, and they all started rushing towards the edge of the clearing where I was hidden. Panic gripped me, and I scrambled to my feet, nearly dropping my camera as I turned and ran blindly into the forest. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, their inhuman screeches echoing through the trees. My lungs were burning as I sprinted as fast as I could, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away from those things. At one point I glanced back over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of my pursuers. Their eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and foam was dripping from their mouths as they chased me. They moved with an inhuman speed and agility, effortlessly keeping pace no matter how fast I ran. I don't know how long I ran for. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. My legs were ready to give out when I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at the small parking area where I'd left my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Just as I got the engine started, the first of the cultists emerged from the forest. I floored it, tires spinning in the dirt as I peeled out onto the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see them gathered at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. Their unholy shrieks faded into the distance as I sped down the winding road, not slowing down until I was miles away. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I was a complete wreck, covered in scratches and bruises, clothes torn, still trembling with fear and adrenaline. I poured myself a stiff drink and tried to process what I'd just experienced. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of hallucination or vivid nightmare. But the scrapes on my arms and the mud caked on my shoes were all too real. I pulled out my camera with shaking hands, praying I had managed to capture some evidence of what I'd seen. But when I looked at the photos, my heart sank. They were all blurry and distorted, showing nothing but vague shapes in the shadows. The one clear shot I had gotten was of the cultists chasing me, but their faces were obscured, hidden beneath those ragged hoods. In the weeks since, I've tried to make sense of what happened that day in the forest. I've pored over my research notes, looking for any clues I might have missed. I've gone back to my source, the old man who first tipped me off, but he claims to have no memory of ever talking to me about strange lights in the woods. The police have been no help either. When I tried to report what I'd seen, they dismissed it as the ramblings of an overworked journalist with an overactive imagination. Without any solid evidence, my editor won't let me publish anything about the cult or the ritual I witnessed. So I'm left with nothing but the nightmares that plague me every time I close my eyes. I see those glowing eyes in the darkness, hear those inhuman shrieks echoing in my ears. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that they've found me, that they're outside my door, waiting to drag me back to that forest clearing to finish their dark ritual. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what really happened that day. All I know is that there's something evil lurking in those woods, something ancient and terrifying that defies rational explanation. And the scariest part is that it's still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. I used to think I was a pretty brave guy, always chasing the next big story no matter the risk. But now I'm afraid to even leave my apartment after dark, because I know the truth about what's really out there in the darkness. And once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. You can never feel truly safe again. So let this serve as a warning to anyone who might stumble across this story. There are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand. Dark secrets hidden just out of sight. And sometimes it's better to leave those secrets buried. Because once you start digging, you might not like what you uncover. And you might find yourself running for your life, pursued by horrors beyond imagination, praying you make it out alive. I was lucky. I escaped. But I'll never be the same. And I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if today is the day they finally find me and finish what they started in that cursed forest clearing. As I rounded a bend, my high beams illuminated a figure on the shoulder, a man, thumb outstretched. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. Too risky these days. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the exhaustion clouding my judgment, or just a moment of misplaced compassion. Either way, I eased onto the shoulder and opened the passenger door. "Where you headed?" I called out as he approached. "Anywhere but here," the man replied with a weary chuckle. He climbed up into the cab, tossing a small duffel bag at his feet. As we pulled back onto the empty highway, I sized him up out of the corner of my eye. Scruffy beard, worn flannel shirt, jeans with holes in the knees. Nothing too out of the ordinary for a hitchhiker. But there was something off about him. A nervous energy, eyes that darted around the cab restlessly. We drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the thrum of tires on asphalt. I was just about to ask where exactly he was coming from when I felt it. Cold steel pressed against my throat. "Pull over, now." His voice was low, menacing. My heart began to race, hands tightening on the wheel. "Take it easy, man. I don't want any trouble. You want money? Take my wallet. It's in my jacket." I said, "Pull over." He jabbed the blade harder against my skin, and I felt a trickle of warmth, blood. Pulse pounding in my ears, I eased the rig onto the shoulder. The hitchhiker's free hand fumbled with the door handle. "Get out. Leave the keys." As he momentarily shifted his attention to the door, I saw my chance. In one desperate move, I slammed on the brakes and threw my elbow back hard, catching him in the face. The knife clattered to the floor as he reeled back, cursing. What happened next was a blur of frantic motion. We grappled in the confines of the cab, a life-or-death struggle. His hands clawed at my face, my throat. I fought back with every ounce of strength I had, knowing my life depended on it. Somehow in the chaos, my hand found the knife on the floor. Without thinking, I swung it wildly behind me. I felt it connect, heard a howl of pain. The hitchhiker's grip loosened, and I seized the moment, reaching across to fling open the passenger door. With one final surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I shoved him out onto the pavement. I slammed the door and gunned the engine, tires squealing as I peeled back onto the highway. My hands shook violently on the wheel as I pushed the rig as fast as it would go, checking the mirrors constantly for any sign of pursuit. After a few miles with no sign of the hitchhiker, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd nearly died. If I hadn't reacted when I did. I shuddered, feeling the ghost of that blade against my throat. My shirt was soaked with sweat and speckled with blood. Mine or his, I wasn't sure. I needed to stop, to call the police. But the thought of pulling over filled me with panic. What if he was still out there? Just then, I saw headlights in my mirror. A car was approaching fast from behind. My heart rate spiked again. Was it him? Had he somehow found another ride and was coming after me to finish what he'd started? The car pulled alongside me and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of the hitchhiker's crazed face, I saw an older couple peering up at me with concern. The woman rolled down her window and called out, "Are you all right, hon? You're swerving all over." I must have looked a mess, wild-eyed, blood on my shirt. I need help," I managed to choke out. "There was a man. He tried to—" The couple exchanged a look. "Pull over up ahead," the man said. "We'll wait with you until the police arrive." Hands still trembling, I guided the rig onto the shoulder once more. True to their word, the couple pulled in behind me and stayed until the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser appeared on the horizon. As I recounted my harrowing story to the officers, it all felt surreal. How quickly a routine night on the road had turned into a fight for my life. They took my statement, collected evidence from the cab, and put out an APB for the hitchhiker. But he was long gone into the night. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me drained and shaken to my core. One of the deputies offered to follow me to the nearest truck stop so I could rest. As we pulled back onto the empty highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The vast darkness that had always been a comfort now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I gave my statement, recovered from my injuries, and moved on. But the truth is, that night changed me forever. For months afterward, I'd jolt awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of that blade at my throat. I couldn't bring myself to drive long-haul routes anymore. The thought of picking up another hitchhiker filled me with paralyzing dread. Even seeing someone standing on the shoulder of the road was enough to send my heart racing. I switched to local routes, day shifts only. But even that wasn't enough to shake the lingering trauma. The open road that had once been my home now felt like a minefield of potential threats. Every rest stop, every dark stretch of highway, every stranger I passed, they all carried the shadow of that terrifying night. In the end, I had to leave trucking altogether. The anxiety and hypervigilance were eating me alive. I found a job at a local warehouse, something stable and predictable. But even now, years later, I still have moments where I'm right back in that cab, fighting for my life. Sometimes I wonder about that hitchhiker. Who was he? Where did he come from? And where was he going? Was I just a random target? Or had he been waiting for the right victim to come along? The police never found him, as far as I know. The thought that he might still be out there, waiting on some lonely stretch of highway for his next victim, still chills me to the bone. I've tried to make sense of it all, to find some meaning or lesson in what happened. But the truth is, sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. One moment of misplaced trust, one split-second decision, and your whole life can change forever. To this day, I can't drive at night without breaking into a cold sweat. The darkness that blankets the highway brings back too many painful memories. I avoid long road trips, always make sure my doors are locked, and never, ever pick up hitchhikers. Some nights, I still wake up in a panic, the ghost of that knife pressed against my throat. In those moments, I have to remind myself that I survived, that I fought back and lived to tell the tale. But a part of me will always be there on that dark stretch of highway, locked in a desperate struggle for survival. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you can never be too careful. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and think twice before extending kindness to strangers on the road. You never know when a simple act of compassion might turn into a fight for your life. It started off as a routine expedition. I'd been tracking a particular pack for weeks, observing their hunting patterns and social dynamics. But on this crisp autumn morning, something felt off. The forest was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual chattering of birds and rustling of small animals. An unsettling stillness hung in the air. As I hiked through a dense patch of pines, I caught sight of movement up ahead. Crouching behind a fallen log, I peered through my binoculars. A group of wolves had gathered in a small clearing about 50 yards away, but their behavior was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The wolves stood unnaturally still, almost rigid, their eyes fixed straight ahead. It was as if they were in some kind of trance. I watched, baffled, as they began to move in perfect unison, taking 3 steps forward, then 2 steps back, over and over again. It was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. My scientific mind raced to explain what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of neurological disorder affecting the pack? A bizarre new hunting technique? But deep down, I knew this was something far stranger and more sinister. I decided to get a closer look. Silently, I crept through the underbrush, using every ounce of my wilderness experience to stay hidden. As I drew nearer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The wolves' eyes, they were blank and glazed over, pupilless orbs of milky white. My heart began to race. What the hell was going on here? Suddenly, a twig snapped beneath my foot. The wolves' heads snapped towards me in perfect synchronization, those dead white eyes boring into me. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, as one, the pack began to advance. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. I could hear the wolves pursuing, their paws thudding against the earth in that same unnatural, perfectly timed rhythm. This defied everything I knew about wolf behavior. It was as if they were being controlled by some outside force. I sprinted until my lungs burned, zigging and zagging between trees, desperate to lose my pursuers. Finally, I spotted a sturdy-looking pine and scrambled up its trunk, not stopping until I'd reached a high branch. Gasping for air, I looked down. The wolves circled the base of the tree, still moving in that eerie unison. But they made no attempt to climb or jump. They simply paced in a perfect circle, round and round, their blank eyes never leaving me. As my breathing slowed, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This was so far beyond the realm of normal animal behavior that my mind struggled to process it. I found myself wishing for a rational explanation, rabies, a brain parasite, anything. But I knew in my gut that this was something much darker. Hours passed. The wolves showed no signs of leaving or tiring. As dusk approached, I realized I'd have to try to wait them out through the night. I secured myself to the trunk with my belt and tried to get comfortable. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those soulless white orbs staring back at me. It was nearing midnight when I heard it, chanting. Low and rhythmic, it drifted through the trees from somewhere to the west. The wolves' ears perked up, and as one they turned and loped off in the direction of the sound. I debated staying put until morning, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was controlling these animals. Carefully, I climbed down and followed the fading sound of chanting. After about 15 minutes of cautious hiking, I came to the edge of a large clearing. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. A group of hooded figures stood in a circle, swaying and chanting in some guttural, inhuman language. Their robes were adorned with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the moonlight. In the center of the circle stood a tall figure wearing an ornate mask carved to resemble a wolf's head. The pack I'd encountered earlier was there, along with at least 20 other wolves. They sat perfectly still around the edge of the clearing, those horrible white eyes fixed on the masked figure. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the chanting reached a fever pitch. The masked figure raised its arms, and the wolves rose as one. What happened next defies explanation. The masked figure began to move its arms in intricate patterns, and the wolves responded like puppet on strings. They leapt and spun through the air in impossible ways, contorting their bodies into shapes that should have broken every bone. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrific spectacle before me. Then, without warning, every head in the clearing, human and wolf alike, turned to face me. I'd been spotted. The masked figure pointed at me and let out an inhuman shriek. The wolves lunged forward, and I finally found the strength to move. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping my face as I tore through the forest. I could hear them behind me, the pounding of paws, yes, but also something else, a sound like cloth sliding over leaves, as if the robed figures were gliding just above the ground in pursuit. My only chance was to make it back to my jeep. I'd parked it about 2 miles from here, at the end of an old logging road. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. Twice I nearly ran headlong into trees in the darkness. Once I stumbled and fell, feeling hot breath on the back of my neck before I scrambled back to my feet. The whole time, that awful chanting echoed through the woods around me. Finally, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and saw my jeep. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands and practically dove inside, locking the doors. As I turned the key in the ignition, dozens of pairs of glowing white eyes emerged from the forest. The wolves and their masters had arrived. I floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As I sped down the bumpy road, I could see dark shapes racing alongside the jeep in my peripheral vision. Something slammed into the side of the vehicle with enough force to dent the door. I kept the pedal to the floor, praying the old jeep would hold together. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I reached the main highway. I roared onto the pavement, not slowing down until the forest was far behind me. Only then did I realize I was sobbing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove straight to the nearest police station and reported everything. They were skeptical, of course, said I must have eaten some bad mushrooms or something. When I insisted, they sent a couple of deputies to check it out. They found nothing, no strange wolves, no robed figures, not even any tracks. I've spent the weeks since that night trying to convince myself it was all a hallucination or a vivid nightmare. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that terrible chanting outside my window. And on nights when the moon is full, I lie awake, wondering what dark rituals are taking place in those woods, and how many other innocent creatures have fallen under the control of those masked monsters. I don't know if I'll ever be able to step foot in a forest again. My life's work, my passion for studying wolves, it's all been tainted by the horrors I witnessed. But I feel compelled to share my story, if only as a warning. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces of darkness that defy explanation. And sometimes they wear familiar faces, even those of the animals we think we know so well. I've been a geologist for over 15 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered deep beneath the Earth's surface last month. It was supposed to be a routine expedition to map out a newly discovered cave system in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. I've explored dozens of caves before, but this one was different. The entrance to the cave system was unremarkable, a narrow opening in the side of a rocky cliff face. My team and I set up base camp nearby and planned to spend about a week mapping out the tunnels and chambers. On the third day of the expedition, I decided to venture deeper into the cave system alone, while the rest of the team worked on cataloging mineral samples closer to the surface. I packed my gear, helmet, headlamp, rope, water, rations, and survey equipment. The first few hours were uneventful as I carefully made my way through winding passages, taking measurements and noting geological features. But as I descended further, I began to notice something odd. The rock formations didn't quite match what I'd expect to see in this region. There were strange, almost organic-looking structures protruding from the walls. At first I thought they might be some kind of unusual mineral deposits, but upon closer inspection, they seemed alive. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just some kind of fungus or bacterial colony I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The deeper I went, the more prevalent and bizarre these growths became. They pulsed faintly in the beam of my headlamp, almost as if they were breathing. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound echoing through the tunnels. It wasn't the normal sounds you'd expect in a cave system. This was different. Alive. My heart started racing as I realized I wasn't alone down here. I contemplated turning back, but my scientific curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was producing those sounds. As I rounded a bend in the tunnel, I came face to face with something that defied explanation. In a vast chamber before me were dozens of creatures. That's the only word I can use to describe them, though it doesn't do justice to their alien nature. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to known life ended. Their bodies seemed to shift and undulate, as if they weren't fully solid. Bioluminescent patches pulsed across their skin in hypnotic patterns. I couldn't make out any discernible eyes, but somehow I knew they were aware of my presence. For a moment, we regarded each other in silence. I was frozen in a mix of terror and awe. Then, without warning, they surged towards me en masse. Their movements were impossibly fast and fluid. I turned and ran, my survival instinct finally kicking in. The next few hours were a nightmare of twisting tunnels and terrifying pursuit. I could hear the creatures scrabbling through the passages behind me, their inhuman cries echoing off the stone walls. My headlamp flickered and died, plunging me into near-total darkness. I stumbled forward, using the cave walls to guide me, praying I was heading towards the surface and not deeper into their domain. At one point, I felt something brush against my leg. I lashed out blindly with my geology hammer, connecting with something soft and yielding. A shrill cry pierced the darkness, and I ran faster, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the cuts and bruises covering my body. I don't know how long I ran or how far. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that lightless hell, but eventually, miraculously, I saw a faint glow ahead. Daylight. With a final burst of desperate energy, I clawed my way towards that sliver of hope. I emerged from the cave, blinking in the harsh sunlight, and collapsed on the ground. My clothes were torn and caked with mud. Blood trickled from dozens of small cuts. But I was alive. I lay there for what felt like hours, gulping in the fresh air, before I could muster the strength to make my way back to base camp. My team was shocked by my appearance and wild story. We immediately broke camp and left the area. I've tried to convince the authorities to seal off that cave system, but without proof, they're skeptical of my claims. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the isolation and darkness played tricks on my mind. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, or wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of those unearthly cries ringing in my ears, and I know with chilling certainty that what I encountered was real. I can't stop thinking about what those creatures were or how long they've been down there. Are there more cave systems harboring similar horrors? What if they find a way to the surface? I've dedicated my life to studying the earth, but now I realize how little we truly know about what lies beneath our feet. There are ancient alien things dwelling in the darkness, and that knowledge haunts me every day. I haven't been in a cave since that day, and I doubt I ever will again. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, but I feel compelled to share my story as a warning. If you're a fellow geologist or cave explorer, be careful out there. There are things in the deep places of the earth that defy our understanding of life itself, and they are hungry. The experience has fundamentally changed me. I used to find comfort in the solidity of rock and earth. Now, I can't shake the feeling that the ground beneath our feet is alive in ways we can't comprehend. Every time I pass a cave entrance or even a deep shadow, my heart races. I've had to take a leave of absence from work. How can I continue my research knowing what's out there? I've tried to find logical explanations for what I saw. Maybe they were some kind of extremophile life form that evolved in isolation over millions of years. Or perhaps they weren't native to Earth at all. Could they be the remnants of some ancient alien civilization that sought refuge underground? But no matter how I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the primordial terror I felt in their presence. The worst part is the lingering doubt. Did I really see what I think I saw? Or did my mind conjure up these horrors as some kind of coping mechanism for the extreme conditions? But then I look at the scars on my body, claw marks that don't match any known animal, and I remember the feeling of my hammer connecting with one of those things, the inhuman shriek it let out. No, it was real, all too real. I've started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, but I can't tell her the whole truth. How could anyone believe me? So I dance around the details, talking about feelings of claustrophobia and being pursued by shadowy figures. It helps a little, but the nightmares persist. In my dreams, I'm back in that cave, but this time I can't find my way out. The creatures surround me, their pseudopods grasping at my limbs, pulling me deeper into the earth. I feel my body changing, becoming like them. I try to scream, but no sound comes out. Then I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around me like grasping tentacles. I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters. Late at night, I scour the internet for stories of cave explorers who've had unusual experiences. Most are clearly hoaxes or can be explained by natural phenomena. But a few send chills down my spine. They describe creatures that sound eerily similar to what I saw. I've tried to contact some of these people, but most don't want to talk about it. The few who do seem just as traumatized as I am. There's a part of me that wants to go back, to prove to myself and the world that these things exist. But the fear is too great. What if I couldn't escape a second time? What if I led others into danger? No, it's better to stay away, to try to forget. But I can't forget. The memory of those creatures is seared into my mind. Their otherworldly movements, the pulsing bioluminescence, the sense of ancient alien intelligence behind their actions. It's changed how I see the world. Every dark corner could be hiding something unnatural. Every unexplored cave could be home to horrors beyond imagination. I find myself staring at the ground, wondering what secrets lie beneath. Are there vast networks of tunnels honeycombing the earth, home to these bizarre life forms? How long have they been down there, evolving in isolation? And what would happen if they ever found their way to the surface en masse? Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear faint scratching sounds coming from deep underground. A subtle vibration in the floor, almost imperceptible. Are they down there, right now, burrowing their way towards the surface? Or is it just my imagination, fueled by trauma and lack of sleep? I've considered going public with my story, but who would believe me? I'd be labeled a crackpot, my professional reputation ruined. And a selfish part of me is glad I don't have proof, because if I did, I'd feel obligated to go back, to study these creatures, to try to understand them. And the thought of returning to those dark tunnels fills me with a primal dread I can't overcome. So I sit here, writing this account, hoping that someone out there will take it seriously. That maybe it will save someone else from stumbling into the lair of these subterranean horrors. If you're a cave explorer, a geologist, or just someone who likes to venture into the wild places of the earth, be careful. Be very careful. There are things in the darkness that should not be disturbed. Things that have been waiting, patient and hungry, for millions of years. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. They'll haunt your dreams and taint your waking hours with the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than we ever imagined. I don't know what the future holds. Will I ever be able to return to my work? Will I ever feel safe in the outdoors again? Or am I doomed to live the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, always wondering if those things are coming for me? All I know is that my encounter in that cave has forever changed me. The solid ground beneath our feet isn't as solid as we think, and in the deepest, darkest places, ancient horrors await those foolish enough to disturb their slumber. It was supposed to be a routine survey of an unexplored region. My team and I had been hacking our way through dense vegetation for days, cataloging plant and animal species. On the fifth day, as we crested a small hill, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees that made me freeze in my tracks. Nestled in a clearing was a collection of primitive huts, clear signs of human habitation where none should exist. My heart started racing with excitement. An undiscovered indigenous tribe, completely isolated from the outside world. It was the kind of discovery anthropologists dream of. I signaled to my team to approach cautiously. As we got closer, I could make out more details. The huts were arranged in a circular pattern around a central clearing. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and I could hear faint voices. We paused at the edge of the village, not wanting to startle the inhabitants. I was about to step forward and announce our presence when something made me hesitate. There was an odd stillness to the air, an unsettling quiet that felt unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I saw it. In the center of the village was something. At first glance, it looked like some kind of crude statue or totem. But as I stared, trying to make sense of its twisted form, I realized with growing horror that it was moving, slowly, rhythmically, like it was breathing. It was massive, easily 15 feet tall. Its body was a repulsive mass of writhing tentacles and pulsating flesh. Multiple eyes blinked and rolled in what I think was its head. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, a villager approached it, carrying a bowl. The creature's body split open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. A long, barbed tongue shot out and snatched the contents of the bowl, which I realized with revulsion was some kind of meat. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this nightmarish scene as possible. But a morbid fascination kept me rooted in place. The villagers seemed to revere this monstrosity. They bowed and chanted as they approached it, offering food and trinkets. Children danced around its base, laughing as its tentacles gently stroked their heads. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the village changed. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. Drums began to beat a driving rhythm. Villagers emerged from their huts wearing elaborate masks and carrying torches. They formed a circle around the creature, swaying and stomping in a hypnotic dance. Then, to my horror, they dragged out a bound and gagged man. He wasn't one of the villagers. His clothes marked him as an outsider like me. His eyes were wide with terror as they forced him to kneel before the pulsating abomination. I knew I should do something, try to help him, but fear kept me paralyzed. I watched, sickened, as the village elder raised a gleaming obsidian knife. The chanting reached a fever pitch. In one swift motion, the elder plunged the knife into the man's chest. His scream was cut short as blood gushed from the wound. The creature's body convulsed in what seemed like ecstasy. Its maw gaped open, wider than should be possible. Tentacles wrapped around the still twitching body and lifted it high. Then, in a single grotesque motion, it shoved the entire corpse into its mouth and swallowed it whole. I must have made some small sound of disgust, because suddenly every head in the village turned towards me. Dozens of eyes locked onto my position, filled with a mix of anger and hunger. The creature let out a bone-chilling shriek that shook the very ground. Panic overtook me. I turned and ran, crashing blindly through the underbrush. I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit behind me. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes. But I didn't slow down. Pure adrenaline and terror drove me forward. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, but I kept going until my legs gave out and I collapsed, gasping for air. As I lay there, my mind reeling, I realized I had no idea where I was or where the rest of my team had gone. The next few days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. I stumbled through the jungle, jumping at every sound, certain that those things were right behind me. I ate whatever I could scavenge and drank from streams, not caring about the risks. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that village of horrors. By some miracle, I eventually stumbled across a logging road. A work crew found me, delirious and babbling about monsters and human sacrifice. They got me to a hospital, where I spent weeks recovering from dehydration, infections, and the sheer psychological trauma of what I'd experienced. I've tried to tell the authorities what I saw, but no one believes me. They say I must have hallucinated from eating toxic plants, or that I'm suffering from some kind of jungle fever. Maybe they're right. Part of me hopes they are, that it was all just some vivid, terrible dream. But deep down, I know the truth. That village is out there, hidden in the depths of the Amazon. That creature, that abomination against nature, is still being worshipped and fed. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear its unearthly shriek echoing in the distance, calling for more sacrifices to satisfy its endless hunger. I don't think I'll ever go back to the jungle. The mysteries and wonders it holds aren't worth the risk of encountering that level of horror again. But I can't help but wonder, how many other villages like that are out there, harboring dark secrets and ancient evils? And what will happen if those evils ever decide to venture beyond their hidden domains? All I know is that I'll never look at the world the same way again. There are things out there beyond our understanding, terrifying things that defy explanation. And sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. Because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back to blissful ignorance. I was an avid camper, always seeking out remote spots to reconnect with nature. That's how I found myself deep in the heart of the Elderwood Forest, miles from the nearest town or cell phone signal. As I hiked along an overgrown trail, I stumbled upon a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. The trees formed a natural circle around a grassy area, creating a cozy, secluded space. I started unpacking my gear, grateful to rest after hours of trekking. As I hammered in tent stakes, I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the clearing. There were strange symbols carved into the bark, intricate spirals and jagged lines that didn't look like any graffiti I'd seen before. I figured some other campers must have left their mark, though the carvings seemed unusually elaborate. As the sun began to set, I got a fire going and heated up some canned soup for dinner. The forest grew quiet, except for the crackling flames and occasional hooting of an owl. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling leaves, but as I listened closer, it sounded more like hushed voices. I couldn't make out any words, just a low murmur that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the dark forest. I tried to ignore it and focus on my dinner, but the whispers persisted. They seemed to ebb and flow, sometimes fading away, only to return louder than before. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking at the edge of the firelight. But there was never anything there, just shadows dancing between the trees. As night fully settled in, the whispers grew more intense. They no longer sounded like wind or leaves. There was a distinctly human quality to them now. Sometimes I thought I could almost make out words, but they remained frustratingly just out of reach of comprehension. The voices seemed to swirl around the clearing, coming from all sides. My heart was pounding as paranoia set in. Were there people out there watching me? Some kind of cult that used these woods for rituals? Or was I losing my mind, hallucinating voices that weren't really there? I tried to rationalize it, but couldn't shake the feeling of being observed by unseen eyes. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would provide an escape. I zipped myself securely in my tent, but the whispers followed me inside. If anything, they sounded even louder and clearer without the crackling fire to mask them. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me, feeling like a child hiding from monsters under the covers. Sleep proved impossible as the voices ebbed and flowed all night. Sometimes they faded to barely audible murmurs. Other times they crescendoed to a fever pitch, as if dozens of people were urgently whispering just outside my tent. I lay paralyzed with fear, afraid to even peek outside. The worst part was the growing certainty that the whispers weren't random. They seemed deliberate, directed at me. Though I couldn't understand the words, The tone felt sinister and mocking. Occasionally I'd catch what sounded like my own name amidst the babble, sending fresh waves of terror through me. I'm not sure if I ever actually fell asleep or just drifted in and out of panic delirium. The voices tormented me all night, filling my head with paranoid thoughts. Were they trying to drive me mad? Lure me out of the tent? I was convinced that if I unzipped the flap, I'd find myself surrounded by dark figures. When the first rays of dawn finally started to brighten my tent, the whispers began to fade. I waited until full daylight before cautiously emerging. The clearing looked peaceful and ordinary in the morning sun, no sign of nocturnal visitors or anything amiss. But the carvings on the trees seemed more prominent now, their jagged lines creating unsettling patterns. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking as I packed up my gear. Though the whispers were gone, I still felt watched. The symbols on the trees seemed to follow me with invisible eyes. I practically ran out of that clearing, not even bothering to stick to the trail in my haste to get away. It wasn't until I was miles away and the forest started to thin that I finally felt safe enough to slow down. I made my way back to civilization in a daze, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Had it all been in my head, some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by isolation? Or was there really something supernatural dwelling in that lonely clearing? I've gone over it 1,000 times since then, but I still can't explain those whispers. All I know is that I'll never set foot in Elderwood Forest again. Some places in this world are not meant for mortal visitors, and that clearing was one of them. The memory of those mocking, sinister voices still haunts my dreams. Sometimes I wake in the night, heart racing, convinced I can hear faint whispers echoing from the shadows of my room. I used to love camping and being alone in nature. But now, the thought of sleeping in a tent fills me with dread. I can't shake the feeling that if I venture into the wilderness again, those voices will be waiting for me. Whatever dwells in that forest clearing is patient, and I fear one day it may find me again, even here in the safety of civilization. So I stay in the city, surrounded by the comfort of electric lights and human voices. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear those sinister whispers calling my name. I was always drawn to stories that others shied away from. As a journalist, I thrived on uncovering the truth, no matter how dark or unsettling it might be. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those remote mountains last summer. It started with a missing persons case that had gone cold. A young woman named Emily had vanished without a trace while hiking in the area nearly a year ago. The local authorities had conducted searches but came up empty-handed. Her family was desperate for answers, and I felt compelled to dig deeper. I packed my gear and headed out to the small mountain town where Emily was last seen. It was a quaint place, the kind of spot tourists flock to for a quiet getaway. But beneath the surface, I sensed an undercurrent of unease. The locals were polite but guarded, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes when I asked about Emily. After a few days of hitting dead ends, I decided to venture further into the wilderness. I figured I might spot something the search parties had missed. The trails were rough and overgrown, clearly not maintained for casual hikers. As I pushed deeper into the forest, an eerie silence settled around me. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was late afternoon when I first spotted the fence. At first, I thought I was seeing things, a chain-link barrier stretching as far as the eye could see, right in the middle of nowhere. My curiosity piqued. I followed its perimeter. That's when I saw the first building through the trees, a large windowless structure that looked completely out of place in the wilderness. My heart raced as I realized I'd stumbled upon something significant. This wasn't just some random outpost. It was an entire hidden community. I crouched low, creeping closer to get a better look. More buildings came into view, along with people moving about. They were dressed plainly, almost like a uniform. Children played in a central area, while adults went about various tasks. I should have left right then, should have hiked back to town and alerted the authorities. But the investigative instinct that had served me so well in the past pushed me forward. I had to know more. Using my camera's zoom lens, I started documenting what I saw. The layout of the buildings, the routines of the people. It all seemed so ordinary at first glance, but there was something off about it. The rigid way they moved, the lack of individual expression. It was like watching automatons go through the motions of daily life. As dusk settled in, I prepared to make my way back. That's when I saw her, a young woman who looked strikingly similar to the missing Emily. My breath caught in my throat. Could it really be her? I zoomed in, trying to get a clear shot of her face, but before I could, a large hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, coming face to face with a burly man in the same plain clothes as the others. His expression was grim as he spoke into a walkie-talkie. "I've got an outsider. Bringing them in." Terror gripped me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I tried to run, but more men emerged from the trees surrounding me. They confiscated my camera and backpack before roughly escorting me through a hidden gate in the fence. The next few hours were a blur of fear and confusion. I was brought to a stark room and left alone, my mind racing with possibilities. What was this place? What did they want with me? The door finally opened, and an older man entered. He introduced himself as the community's leader, his tone calm, but with an underlying threat. "We don't take kindly to trespassers," he said, "especially those who seek to expose our way of life." I tried to explain that I was just investigating a missing person, but he cut me off. "There are no missing people here. Only those who have chosen to leave behind the corrupt outside world and embrace our truth." Over the next several hours, he laid out the community's beliefs and structure. They saw themselves as the chosen few, living apart from a society they viewed as irredeemable. Their isolation was self-imposed, and they went to great lengths to maintain it. As he spoke, I began to understand the insidious nature of what I'd stumbled upon. This wasn't just an isolated group. It was a cult, complete with oppressive rules and manipulative practices. I asked about Emily directly, and a flicker of recognition passed over his face before he schooled his features. "The one you knew as Emily came to us willingly. She has embraced our ways and left her old life behind." But I knew it was a lie. The woman I'd seen looked scared, her movements furtive, as if always watching for danger. This place wasn't a sanctuary, it was a prison. As night fell, I was moved to a small cabin on the outskirts of the compound. 2 guards were posted outside, making it clear that any attempt to escape would be met with force. I lay awake, my mind churning with everything I'd learned. The leader's words kept replaying in my head. "Those who seek to expose our way of life." It was clear they had no intention of letting me leave with what I knew. I must have dozed off eventually because I was jolted awake by a commotion outside. Shouts and the sound of running feet filtered through the thin walls. For a moment, I thought they were coming for me. But then I heard a woman's voice, high and panicked. "She's gone! The fence is cut!" My heart leapt. Could it be Emily? Had she finally found a way to escape? The guards outside my cabin were distracted. arguing about whether to leave their post. It was now or never. I slipped out the window, my legs shaky but adrenaline propelling me forward. I stuck to the shadows, making my way towards where I thought the fence might be. Voices echoed through the night, growing closer. They were organizing search parties. I had to move faster. Just when I thought I was lost, I spotted a section of fence with a ragged hole cut through it. Beyond it, I could make out a figure running into the woods. Without hesitation, I squeezed through, feeling the sharp metal edges tear at my clothes. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear shouts growing more distant, but I didn't slow down, didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. Huddled nearby was the woman I'd seen earlier, Emily. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of hope there, too. You're not one of them," she whispered. I shook my head, still struggling to catch my breath. "I'm a journalist. I've been looking for you." Tears welled up in her eyes as she told me her story. She'd come to the community willingly at first, drawn in by their promises of a better life. But once inside, she'd discovered the truth. An oppressive regime that used fear and manipulation to keep its members in line. She'd been trying to escape for months, but they always caught her. Until tonight. We didn't have long to talk. In the distance, we could hear voices drawing closer. Emily knew these woods better than I did, so I followed her lead as we made our way down the mountain. It was a grueling journey, every snapping twig making us freeze in terror. But somehow, we made it. As the first light of dawn broke, we stumbled into the small town where I'd started my investigation. The local sheriff was shocked to see us, especially when he recognized Emily. Within hours, the mountain was swarming with state police and FBI agents. The raid on the compound revealed horrors beyond what I'd imagined. Dozens of people held against their will, evidence of abuse and coercion. The leaders were arrested, and the victims were finally free. But even as justice was served, I couldn't shake the lingering effects of what I'd experienced. The fear, the sense of being watched. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'm back in that stark room, facing a leader who saw nothing wrong with stripping away people's freedom in the name of his twisted ideology. I wrote my story, exposing the truth of what had happened in those mountains, but no amount of accolades or professional satisfaction can erase the trauma of those days. I set out to uncover the truth about one missing woman and ended up exposing a hidden world of oppression and fear. It's a reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets lurk in the most unexpected places, and that the pursuit of truth can come at a heavy personal cost. I was always drawn to adventure, the thrill of discovering the unknown. That's what led me to that remote tropical island in the first place. I had heard rumors of an ancient temple hidden deep in the jungle, untouched by modern eyes. The locals warned me not to go, speaking in hushed tones of an ancient curse, but I brushed off their superstitions. How I wish I had listened. The journey to the island was treacherous enough. My small chartered boat was tossed about by massive waves as we approached the rocky shore. The captain refused to take me any closer, so I had to swim the last 100 yards, dragging my gear behind me. Exhausted, I collapsed on the beach, the thick, humid air already making it hard to breathe. I spent that first day hacking my way through the dense jungle vegetation. The heat was oppressive, sweat constantly dripping into my eyes. Strange bird calls echoed all around, giving me an eerie feeling of being watched. As the sun began to set, I finally spotted it through a break in the trees, weathered stone walls rising out of the forest canopy. My heart racing with excitement, I quickened my pace. The temple was even more impressive up close, a massive pyramid-like structure covered in intricate carvings. Vines and roots had worked their way between the stones over the centuries, but it was remarkably well preserved. I set up camp at the base, eager to begin my exploration at first light. I didn't sleep well that night. The jungle sounds seemed to grow louder and more menacing in the darkness. Several times I jolted awake, convinced I had heard whispers or footsteps nearby. But each time I shone my flashlight around, there was nothing there. As soon as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, I was up and gearing up to enter the temple. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the stone face. I flicked on my headlamp and ducked inside, immediately enveloped by cool, stale air. The beam of light illuminated elaborate wall carvings depicting what looked like ancient rituals. Many showed humanoid figures with animalistic features, snarling jaguar heads, wings, serpentine lower bodies. In the center of each scene was a terrifying deity figure, its face a twisted mass of tentacles. I made my way deeper, the passageways twisting and turning. In some chambers I found crumbling stone altars, stained dark with what I prayed wasn't dried blood. Others held pedestals displaying ancient artifacts, ceremonial daggers, ornate jewelry, small idols carved from some strange green stone. My excitement grew with each new discovery. This place was an archaeologist's dream. I carefully photographed and cataloged everything, already imagining the academic papers I would write. But as the day wore on, a growing sense of unease began to gnaw at me. It started subtly at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but saw only shadows. Then I started to hear things, whispers just on the edge of hearing, the sound of bare feet slapping on stone. Each time I whirled around, lamps searching the darkness, but found nothing. I tried to shake it off, to focus on my work, but the feeling only grew stronger. The very air seemed to grow thicker, making it hard to breathe. My head started to pound, vision blurring at the edges. I found myself losing track of time, snapping back to awareness in rooms I didn't remember entering. That's when I saw it, a flickering shadow at the edge of my light. I froze, heart pounding. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall and thin, with oddly jointed limbs. Before I could get a better look, it darted away down a side passage. Pulse racing, I debated what to do. The logical part of my brain said it must have been a trick of the light, or maybe some animal that had found its way inside. But a more primal instinct was screaming at me to run. In the end, curiosity won out. I had to know what I had seen. I crept down the corridor, straining my ears for any sound. The passageway opened into a large, circular chamber. My light swept across more horrific carvings, centering on a raised dais. Atop it sat a strange object, a smooth black sphere about the size of a bowling ball. Drawn by some compulsion I couldn't explain, I approached it. The sphere seemed to absorb the light, no reflection visible on its glossy surface. Without thinking, I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through me. I tried to pull away, but my hand seemed fused to the orb. Whispering filled my head, 1,000 voices speaking in some ancient tongue. Visions flashed before my eyes, blood-soaked rituals, monstrous creatures rising from the depths, civilizations crumbling to dust. I felt something dark and alien trying to worm its way into my mind. With a Herculean effort, I managed to wrench my hand free. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. That's when I realized I was no longer alone in the chamber. Shadowy figures lined the walls, their features obscured but radiating malevolent intent. They began to close in, reaching out with twisted limbs. Panic overtook me. I turned and ran, no longer caring about direction. My only thought was escape. Corridors and chambers blurred past as I sprinted through the darkness. Several times I tripped and fell, bloodying my hands and knees on the rough stone floor. But terror drove me on. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back. Somehow I burst out of the temple entrance, nearly blinded by the sudden sunlight. I didn't stop running until I reached the beach, collapsing into the sand as the adrenaline finally wore off. As my racing heart slowed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some kind of hallucination brought on by the stale air and isolation? But the scrapes on my palms and torn clothing were all too real, and I could still feel the lingering touch of that alien presence in my mind, trying to take hold. I made my way back to my camp in a daze. My equipment was right where I had left it, looking obscenely mundane after what I had experienced. I didn't even bother breaking down the tent, just grabbed my satellite phone with shaking hands. It took some frantic convincing, but I managed to get the boat captain to come back for me that same day. As we pulled away from the island, I watched the temple recede into the distance. Part of me still wanted to go back, to study its secrets, but a larger part was relieved to see it vanish into the jungle. I've tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, some combination of dehydration, isolation, and an overactive imagination. But in my darkest moments, I can still hear those whispers, still feel that something reached out and touched me in that temple. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or did I bring something back with me, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know one thing. Some places are meant to stay hidden. Some secrets are better left buried, and I'll never set foot on that island again. As the day wore on, a thick fog started rolling in. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but something about it felt different. The air grew heavy, and an eerie silence fell over the water. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I saw it. Through the mist, the silhouette of a massive ship emerged. At first I thought it must be a cargo vessel, but as I got closer, I realized it was unlike any modern ship I'd ever seen. It looked old, really old, like something out of a history book. My curiosity got the better of me. I steered my boat towards the mysterious vessel, thinking maybe it was some kind of historical reenactment or movie prop. As I approached, I called out, but there was no response. The ship loomed over me, its hull dark and weathered. I tied my boat to a rusty ladder on the side of the ship and climbed up. The metal was cold and slick under my hands, and I had to be careful not to slip. When I reached the deck, I was hit by a wave of musty air that made me gag. The deck was completely deserted. There were no signs of life, no sounds of machinery or crew, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked across the creaking wooden planks, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I called out again, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice seemed to be swallowed up by the fog. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no modern equipment anywhere. No radios, no life rafts, nothing that you'd expect to see on a ship. It was like stepping back in time. As I explored further, I found myself drawn to the captain's quarters. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The room was in disarray, papers scattered everywhere, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. It looked like whoever had been here left in a hurry, and a long time ago. I picked up a logbook from the desk, its pages yellow and brittle. The last entry was dated 1897. My heart started racing. This couldn't be real. How could a ship this old still be floating? And where was the crew? That's when I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere below deck. It sounded like laughter, but not the kind of laughter that makes you feel good. This was different, unsettling. It echoed through the ship, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity pushed me forward. I found the stairs leading below deck and descended into the darkness. The laughter grew louder, more maniacal. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the way. The lower deck was a maze of narrow corridors and locked doors. The laughter seemed to be coming from behind one of them. I approached slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. Just as I was about to open it, the laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, from right behind the door, I heard a voice whisper, "Welcome aboard." It was unlike any human voice I'd ever heard, raspy, ancient, and filled with malice. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over myself in my haste to get away. I ran back up the stairs, tripping and scraping my hands on the rough wood. The laughter started again, louder this time, seeming to follow me as I sprinted across the deck. As I reached the side of the ship where I had tied my boat, I realized with horror that the fog had thickened. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The laughter was all around now, mixed with the sound of footsteps and creaking wood. I practically threw myself down the ladder, my hands slipping on the wet metal. I landed hard in my boat, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Without thinking, I cut the rope with my fishing knife and started the engine. As I sped away, I could still hear the laughter fading into the distance. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. I just kept going, pushing my little boat as fast as it would go, desperate to put as much distance between me and that nightmare ship as possible. It felt like hours before I finally made it back to the harbor. By then, the fog had lifted, and it was a beautiful, clear afternoon. If it weren't for the bruises on my hands and the tear in my jacket, I might have convinced myself it was all a bad dream. I reported what I saw to the Coast Guard, but they found nothing. No ship, no distress signals, nothing out of the ordinary. They chalked it up to my imagination, maybe heat stroke or dehydration. But I know what I saw, what I heard. It's been months now, and I haven't been able to bring myself to go back out on the water. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that laughter, feel the cold dread of that ghostly ship. I don't know what I encountered out there, but I'm certain of one thing. It wasn't of this world. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any record of a ship that matches what I saw. But there's nothing. It's like it never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy. But then I look at the logbook I grabbed in my panic, the one piece of evidence I have that it wasn't all in my head. The pages are filled with accounts of strange occurrences, crew members disappearing, and a captain slowly losing his mind. The final entry chills me to the bone every time I read it. God help us. They're here. I don't know what happened to that ship or its crew, but I do know that something evil is out there, drifting in the fog, waiting for unsuspecting souls to stumble upon it. And if you ever find yourself face to face with an old ship emerging from the mist, don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Turn around and don't look back. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. As I got closer, I saw it was a small gas station, not much more than a couple of rusty pumps and a tiny convenience store. The sign was faded and flickering, but it was open. I breathed a sigh of relief and pulled in, eager to fill up my tank and grab some snacks for the road. The moment I stepped out of my car, though, an uneasy feeling washed over me. The air felt heavy and still, like right before a storm. There were no other vehicles around, just my car under the harsh fluorescent lights. As I walked towards the store, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched. Inside, a bell jangled as I opened the door. The cashier, an older man with a scraggly beard, looked up from his newspaper. His eyes were cold and piercing as they locked onto me. He didn't say a word, just stared as I nervously grabbed some chips and a Red Bull. As I approached the counter, I noticed a few other people in the store that I hadn't seen at first. They were all locals by the looks of it, rough-looking men in work clothes and hunting gear. They weren't shopping or talking, just standing silently and watching me. My heart started to race. "Just these and $40 on pump 3, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The cashier rang me up in silence, his eyes never leaving my face. As I turned to leave, I heard hushed whispers behind me. I quickened my pace, wanting nothing more than to get out of there. Back at my car, my hands shook as I tried to work the pump. The whole time, I could feel eyes on me from the store windows. As I replaced the nozzle, I heard the bell jingle again. The locals were filing out of the store, spreading out across the lot. They weren't coming towards me exactly, but they were definitely positioning themselves strategically. Trying not to panic, I got in my car and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the road, I saw headlights flick on in my rearview mirror. A truck was following me. Then another set of lights appeared, and another. My heart pounding, I pressed down on the gas. The speedometer climbed as I took the dark curves as fast as I dared. But the headlights behind me kept pace, sometimes falling back on the turns, but always catching up on the straightaways. I had no idea where I was or where I was going. The road twisted through thick woods with no signs or landmarks. All I knew was that I had to keep driving, had to get away from whoever was chasing me. After what felt like hours of this terrifying pursuit, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the right. Without thinking, I cut the wheel hard and flew down it, praying it wouldn't dead end. The truck behind me overshot the turn. I killed my headlights and kept going, branches scraping against the sides of my car. Finally, the road opened up into a clearing. I pulled over and cut the engine, sitting in total darkness and silence. My whole body was shaking. I strained my ears for any sound of engines or tires on gravel, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, afraid to move or make a sound. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. As dawn broke, I could see I was in some kind of abandoned campground or picnic area. There were a few dilapidated wooden structures nearby, overtaken by vines and weeds. Exhausted but still on high alert, I carefully made my way back to the main road. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a busy truck stop just outside a major city. Only then did I finally feel safe enough to pull over and try to process what had happened. To this day, I have no explanation for the events of that night. Who were those people? What did they want with me? Was I just being paranoid, or was I really in danger? I've tried researching that area, looking for any stories of similar incidents, but I've found nothing concrete. All I know is that I'll never forget the cold dread I felt in that gas station, or the panic as those headlights chased me through the darkness. I don't take rural back roads at night anymore, and I always make sure my tank is full before setting out on long drives. You never know what might be waiting for you out there in the middle of nowhere. The experience left me shaken for months afterwards. I had trouble sleeping, constantly reliving those terrifying moments in my dreams. Even now, years later, I get anxious whenever I see a small, isolated gas station. The rational part of my brain knows it's unlikely to happen again, but the fear is still there, lurking just below the surface. I've tried to find logical explanations for what occurred that night. Maybe it was just some locals messing with an out-of-towner, or perhaps I misinterpreted their actions due to fatigue and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know something sinister was at play. The coordinated way they spread out in the parking lot, the relentless pursuit down those winding roads. It felt calculated, like they'd done this before. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to lose them on that dirt road. Would they have eventually caught up to me? What were their intentions? The possibilities my mind conjures up are too horrifying to dwell on. I've become somewhat obsessed with researching similar incidents in that region. While I haven't found any exact matches to my experience, there are occasional reports of travelers having strange, unsettling encounters at remote gas stations. Nothing as extreme as what I went through, but enough to make me believe I'm not entirely alone in what I experienced. One thing that continues to haunt me is the expression on the cashier's face. It wasn't just unfriendly or suspicious. There was a cold, predatory look in his eyes that chilled me to my core, like he was sizing me up, deciding my fate. I'll never forget that gaze as long as I live. I've considered reporting the incident to the authorities, but what would I even say? I have no proof, no specifics on the location, not even a clear description of my pursuers. And part of me is afraid that looking into it further might somehow bring those people back into my life. So I've kept it to myself, only sharing anonymously online like I'm doing now. The whole ordeal has changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I'm more cautious now, always hyper-aware of my surroundings. I've become an expert in planning routes, researching stops, and being prepared for any situation on the road. Some might call it paranoia, but I see it as a necessary adaptation after what I've been through. Despite everything, I still love road trips and the freedom of the open highway. I refuse to let that one horrifying night rob me of something I enjoy. But I'll never again take for granted the vulnerability of being alone on a dark, deserted stretch of road. The world can be a dangerous place, and sometimes the real monsters are all too human. In sharing this story, I hope to warn others to stay vigilant, especially when traveling in unfamiliar areas. Trust your instincts if something feels off. Be aware of your surroundings, and always have a plan B. You never know when you might need it. To this day, I occasionally find myself scanning the rearview mirror for pursuing headlights, even on busy highways in broad daylight. It's like a reflex now, an ingrained survival instinct born from that harrowing night. In a way, those few hours changed my entire perspective on the world and my place in it. I've often wondered about the lives of those people at the gas station. What drives someone to potentially prey on innocent travelers? Are they part of some sinister backwoods cult, or just bored locals with a twisted sense of entertainment? The not knowing is almost worse than any explanation I can imagine. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find that gas station in the light of day. But every time I consider it, a wave of panic washes over me. What if they recognized me? What if I never made it back out? No, some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'll carry this experience with me always, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can shift into nightmare. If you're reading this and have ever experienced anything similar, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, consider yourself lucky. But also consider this a warning. The next time you're on a long, lonely drive and see a light in the distance, think twice before pulling over. It might just save your life. Was on assignment to photograph abandoned coastal villages for a magazine feature. As a freelance photographer, I'm always eager for these kind of atmospheric shoots. Little did I know this particular job would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. The village I was documenting that day clung precariously to a wind-swept cliff overlooking the churning sea. As I drove up the winding coastal road, the desolate beauty of the place struck me immediately. Dilapidated wooden houses with peeling paint stood silent sentinel over the rocky shore. Rusted fishing boats lay scattered on the beach like discarded toys. An eerie stillness hung in the air, broken only by the cries of seagulls and the relentless pounding of the waves. I parked my car at the edge of the village and grabbed my camera gear. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as I made my way down the overgrown main street. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the weather-beaten boardwalk. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I knew the village had been deserted for decades. For the next couple hours, I lost myself in capturing the haunting decay of the abandoned buildings. I snapped photos of sagging rooflines silhouetted against the sky, rusty door hinges, shattered windows that stared blankly like dead eyes. The fading light lent a golden glow to everything, softening the harsh edges of neglect. As the sun began to set, I decided to head out to the cliff's edge to try and get some dramatic landscape shots. That's when things took a turn I still can't fully explain. I was focusing my lens on the horizon, where the sea met the darkening sky when movement caught my eye. I lowered my camera, startled to see a young woman standing at the very edge of the cliff about 50 yards away. She wore a simple white dress that rippled in the wind. Her long dark hair streamed out behind her. For a moment I just stared, wondering where she could have come from. I hadn't seen any other cars or people all afternoon. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She seemed translucent. I could see the faint outline of the cliffs and sea through her body. My hands shook as I raised my camera again, desperate to capture proof of what I was seeing. But when I looked through the viewfinder, she was gone. I blinked hard and scanned the cliff edge, but there was no sign of her. Heart pounding, I quickly packed up my gear. As I hurried back to my car, the sun dipped below the horizon and twilight deepened the shadows around me. The houses loomed ominously, and I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind. I practically ran the last few yards to my vehicle. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back toward the cliff. My breath caught in my throat. The woman in white stood at the end of the street, pale and ethereal in the fading light. This time I knew I wasn't imagining things. She was looking right at me with an expression of infinite sadness. I wrenched open the car door and threw myself inside, hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked up. She was gone again. I peeled out of there so fast, I'm surprised I didn't go off the road. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her ghostly form in the back seat. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I immediately pulled out my laptop and started going through the photos from the shoot. My hands were still shaking as I clicked through image after image of crumbling buildings and wave-battered cliffs. And then I saw it. In one of the last photos I'd taken, barely visible in the background, was the faint outline of a woman in white standing at the cliff's edge. The image was blurry, but unmistakable. I stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. I barely slept that night, and the next day I called the magazine editor to let her know I couldn't finish the assignment. I made up some excuse about equipment failure. There was no way I was going back to that village. In the weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching the history of the abandoned fishing village. I scoured old newspaper archives and local history books, looking for any mention of mysterious deaths or disappearances. I even reached out to a few paranormal investigation groups, though I felt ridiculous doing so. My search turned up a few vague legends about the area being haunted, but nothing concrete. The village had been slowly abandoned over the course of several decades as the fishing industry declined. There were no dramatic stories of mass tragedy or ghostly sightings, and yet I knew what I had seen. The image of that spectral woman still haunted my dreams. I found myself unable to focus on new photography jobs. My hands would shake whenever I picked up a camera, remembering how I'd failed to capture clear evidence of my encounter. I started seeing a therapist, trying to process the experience. She gently suggested that stress and isolation could have caused me to hallucinate or misinterpret something I'd seen. But I knew it was more than that. The photo, blurry as it was, proved I wasn't just imagining things. As the months passed, I slowly began to resume my normal life and work. But I never forgot that day at the cliff's edge. Sometimes, when I'm out on a shoot in a remote location, I'll catch a glimpse of something white out of the corner of my eye. My heart always skips a beat before I realize it's just a plastic bag caught on a fence or a far-off bird. I've never told this story publicly before. I know how it sounds, like the fevered imaginings of an overworked mind. But I know what I saw that day. There are things in this world that defy explanation, hovering just at the edges of our perception. I got a glimpse behind the veil, and it changed me forever. To this day, I keep that blurry photo locked away in a drawer. Sometimes late at night, I'll take it out and stare at it, trying to make sense of what happened. Part of me wants to return to that desolate village, to see if I can find answers. But a deeper part knows that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Whatever phantom I encountered that day, I hope she's found peace. As for me, I'll carry the memory of our brief encounter for the rest of my days. We were making good progress up the mountain when suddenly the weather took a drastic turn for the worse. A vicious storm rolled in out of nowhere, whipping up howling winds and blinding snow. Visibility dropped to near zero in a matter of minutes. I lost sight of my climbing partners and found myself completely alone on the mountainside, battered by the elements. I knew I had to find shelter fast or risk freezing to death. Stumbling through the whiteout conditions, I desperately searched for any kind of refuge from the storm. That's when I spotted the faint glow of light in the distance. Relief washed over me. It had to be other climbers or a rescue team. I pushed onwards towards the light, fighting against the raging winds with every step. As I got closer, I could make out the shapes of several figures huddled together. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. "Over here!" The figures turned towards me, and I felt a surge of hope. But as they approached, that hope quickly turned to dread. Something was off about them. Their movements were stiff and unnatural, and their faces. I'll never forget those faces as long as I live. Pale, almost bluish skin stretched taut over their skulls. Sunken, lifeless eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I realized with horror that these weren't rescuers at all. They were something else, something not quite human. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place as they encircled me. One of them reached out a gnarled hand towards me. I recoiled from its icy touch. That seemed to trigger something in them. Suddenly they were grabbing at me from all sides, their bony fingers clawing at my clothes and gear. Adrenaline kicked in, and I fought back with everything I had. I swung my ice axe wildly, connecting with a sickening crunch. But there were too many of them. They began dragging me towards the edge of a sheer cliff face. With horror, I realized their intentions. They were going to throw me off the mountain. Panic gave me a burst of desperate strength. I managed to wrench myself free from their grasp, losing my backpack in the process. I took off running blindly through the snow, not caring which direction as long as it was away from those things. I could hear them in pursuit, their eerie shrieks carried on the howling wind. I ran until my lungs were burning, stumbling and falling repeatedly in the deep snow. Eventually I found myself in a narrow ice canyon. The walls of blue-white ice towered above me on both sides. I spotted a small crevice and squeezed myself inside, praying it would be enough to hide me. For what felt like hours, I huddled there in terror, listening for any sign of my pursuers. The storm continued to rage outside. I was freezing, exhausted, and completely disoriented. I had lost most of my gear in the struggle and knew my chances of survival were slim. But the alternative, being caught by those things, was unthinkable. As the long night wore on, my mind raced with questions. What were those creatures? How long had they been up here on the mountain? Were they somehow the ghosts of climbers who had perished here over the years? None of it made any sense. Just when I thought I couldn't take the cold and fear any longer, I heard voices, human voices. For a moment I was afraid to hope, terrified it might be another trick. But then I saw the beams of flashlights sweeping the canyon. "Hello? Is anyone there?" a man called out. I stumbled out of my hiding spot, barely able to stand. Here," I managed to croak out. "I'm here." The rescue team rushed towards me, wrapping me in emergency blankets. As they carried me to safety, I tried to tell them about the creatures I'd encountered, but hypothermia and exhaustion were setting in. My words came out as confused mumbling. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital rooms and debriefings. I told my story over and over to fellow climbers, doctors, even a psychiatrist. Most dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by altitude sickness and exposure. A few seemed to half believe me, sharing whispered stories of other strange encounters on the mountain over the years. But I know what I saw was real. Those things were up there, hiding in the endless white, waiting. I still have nightmares about those sunken eyes and grasping hands. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm back in that icy crevice, listening for approaching footsteps in the howling wind. I've tried to put that day behind me and move on with my life, but a part of me remains forever on that mountain, trapped in an endless loop of terror. I've never climbed again. I can't even look at snow without feeling a chill run down my spine. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed quiet, if telling my story has only put others in danger. What if someone reads this and decides to go looking for those creatures? The thought keeps me up at night. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces of nature, or perhaps something else entirely, that we were never meant to encounter. That mountain holds secrets that should remain buried beneath the ice and snow. To anyone reading this who might be planning their own Everest expedition, I beg you to reconsider. The summit isn't worth the risk. Some peaks were never meant to be conquered. Some questions are better left unanswered. Take it from someone who learned the hard way. There are fates far worse than death waiting in those frigid heights. Things that will haunt you long after you've left the mountain behind. Heed my warning, or you may find yourself face to face with horrors beyond imagination. I still don't know if I truly escaped that day, or if a part of me will always be trapped up there, running endlessly through the snow as inhuman shrieks echo all around me. All I can do now is try to live with the nightmares and pray that those things never find their way down from the mountain, because if they do, God help us all. I was on assignment in a remote valley, capturing the pristine beauty of nature for a wildlife magazine. As a nature photographer, I'd been to some pretty isolated places before, but this location took it to another level. The rugged mountain terrain stretched as far as the eye could see, with no signs of civilization for miles around. It was just me, my camera gear, and the great outdoors. I had set up camp near a picturesque lake, planning to spend a few days shooting landscapes and hopefully catching some glimpses of local wildlife. The first couple nights were uneventful, peaceful even. I got some great shots of the starry night sky reflected in the still waters of the lake. But on the third night, things took a strange turn. I was sitting by my campfire, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop, when I noticed an odd light in the sky. At first I thought it was just a particularly bright star, but then I realized it was moving, and not in any normal aircraft pattern I'd ever seen before. The light darted back and forth erratically, changing directions at impossible angles and speeds. Sometimes it would hover motionlessly for several seconds before zipping off again. My heart started racing as I watched this bizarre aerial dance play out above me. What the hell was I seeing? I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos. But in the darkness, I couldn't tell if I was actually capturing anything. The light continued its strange movements for maybe 10 minutes before suddenly winking out of existence. I was left staring at an empty night sky, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the sighting over and over in my mind. By morning, I had convinced myself I needed to investigate further. If there was something strange going on in this valley, I was determined to document it. I packed up some supplies and my camera gear and set off hiking deeper into the mountains, in the general direction where I had seen the lights. It was slow going over the rough terrain, but my curiosity propelled me forward. After several hours of trekking, I crested a ridge and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There in the valley below was some kind of large compound, all sleek metal and concrete, completely incongruous with the wild surroundings. High fences topped with razor wire encircled the facility. Warning signs were posted at regular intervals. My mind was reeling. What was a place like this doing out here in the middle of nowhere? It had to be some kind of secret government installation. But for what purpose? And could it be connected to the strange lights I saw? Crouching behind some boulders, I pulled out my telephoto lens and started taking photos of the compound. Through the lens, I could make out guards patrolling the perimeter and what looked like concealed gun emplacements. This was no ordinary research station. I was so engrossed in photographing the facility that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind me until it was too late. Suddenly, rough hands were grabbing me, forcing me to the ground. My camera was ripped away as a bag was shoved over my head. I tried to struggle, but someone pressed a knee into my back, pinning me down. "We've got an intruder," a gruff voice said. "Take him in for questioning." I was hauled to my feet and marched down the mountain, stumbling blindly over the uneven ground. Terror gripped me as I realized the serious trouble I was in. What would they do to me? After what felt like an eternity of walking, we stopped, and I heard the beeping of some kind of electronic lock. A door opened, and I was roughly shoved inside. The bag was yanked off my head, and I found myself in a stark white room, reminiscent of an interrogation chamber from a spy movie. Two men in dark suits stood before me, their faces impassive. One gestured for me to sit in a metal chair in the center of the room. As I shakily lowered myself into the seat, the other man spoke. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" he demanded. I stammered out that I was just a nature photographer on assignment, that I had gotten lost and stumbled upon the facility by accident. They clearly didn't buy it. "Don't lie to us," the first man snapped. "We know you've been taking photos. Who sent you? What agency are you working for?" "No one sent me," I protested. "I swear I'm not a spy or anything. I just saw some weird lights in the sky last night and wanted to investigate." At the mention of lights, the two men exchanged a significant glance. The interrogation intensified from there. For hours they grilled me relentlessly about every detail of what I had seen, what I was doing in the area, who knew I was here. No matter how many times I told them the truth, they refused to believe me. Eventually, they seemed to tire of the questioning. One of the men pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "Last chance to come clean," he said ominously. "Otherwise, we'll have to use more persuasive methods." Panic flooded through me. "Please," I begged, "I've told you everything. I don't know anything else." The man raised the syringe, preparing to inject me. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was about to happen. But then a voice crackled over an intercom. "Stand down! Orders from above! Release him!" My eyes flew open in shock. The two men looked equally surprised, but after a moment's hesitation they complied. I was blindfolded again and led out of the room. I felt myself being loaded into some kind of vehicle that drove for about an hour before stopping. When the blindfold was removed, I found myself standing alone on a dirt road in the mountains, miles from where I had been captured. My camera and other possessions were piled on the ground next to me. Before I could say anything, the vehicle that had brought me sped off, leaving me in a cloud of dust. I stood there for several minutes, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Why had they let me go? What was really going on at that facility? As I gathered my things and began the long walk back to my campsite, a chill ran down my spine. I realized that all the photos I had taken of the compound were gone from my camera's memory card. The only evidence left of my ordeal were the vivid, terrifying memories seared into my brain. That night, as I huddled in my tent, I saw the strange lights in the sky again. But this time I didn't feel any excitement or curiosity, only fear. Fear of what lurked in the darkness, of forces beyond my comprehension. I packed up and left the valley at first light the next morning. To this day, I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me out there. Who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But then I'll catch a glimpse of an unusual light in the night sky, and the memories come flooding back. Whatever I stumbled upon in those remote mountains, it was something the government desperately wanted to keep secret. And that's a truth that haunts me to this day. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, always wondering what other hidden facilities might be out there, watching from the shadows. It was my third week trekking through the dense jungle. The humidity was suffocating, my clothes perpetually damp with sweat. Insects buzzed incessantly around me as I hacked through the thick vegetation with my machete. I had long since lost contact with my support team via satellite phone. The dense canopy blocked any signal. I was truly alone out here. As I pushed through a particularly overgrown section of forest, I suddenly found myself on the edge of a large clearing. My heart raced with excitement. This was clearly man-made. Could I have stumbled upon the remains of some lost civilization? But as my eyes adjusted to the brighter light, I realized this was no ancient ruin. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a village. Primitive thatched huts formed a rough circle around a central plaza. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, and there were people, dozens of them, going about their daily lives as if it was the most normal thing in the world to have a village hidden away in this remote wilderness. I stood frozen at the edge of the trees, not sure how to proceed. Part of me wanted to announce my presence immediately, eager to make contact, but caution held me back. I decided to observe for a while first, to get a sense of who these people were before revealing myself. As I watched, I began to notice odd details about the village. The huts were decorated with strange symbols, painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The villagers themselves moved with an unnatural, almost robotic gait. And their faces, something was off about their faces, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Night began to fall, and I prepared to make camp at a safe distance. But as darkness enveloped the jungle, the village came alive with activity. Torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The villagers gathered in the central plaza, forming a circle around something I couldn't quite see. Curiosity overcame my apprehension. I crept closer, using the deepening shadows for cover. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I could hear chanting, low, guttural sounds that sent chills down my spine. The circle of villagers parted slightly, and I caught my first glimpse of what was at the center. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. There, illuminated by the torchlight, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. Skin a sickly gray-green color that seemed to pulse and writhe of its own accord. Its face was a mass of writhing tentacles surrounding a gaping maw lined with needle-sharp teeth. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The villagers began to sway in unison, their movements becoming more and more erratic. And then, to my horror, I saw one of them step forward into the circle. The creature's tentacles lashed out, wrapping around the villager and dragging them closer. I wanted to look away, but I was paralyzed with fear. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my days. The creature's mouth opened impossibly wide, and it began to consume the villager, but not in any way I'd ever seen before. It was as if the person's very essence was being drained away, their body shriveling and collapsing in on itself, until nothing remained but a dried husk. The other villagers showed no reaction to this horrific sight. If anything, their chanting grew more enthusiastic. One by one, they stepped forward to be consumed by the abomination in their midst. I realized with growing terror that this wasn't some isolated incident. This was a regular occurrence for these people. They weren't victims. They were willing participants in this nightmare. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in horror. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Eventually, my survival instinct kicked in, screaming at me to run. I turned and fled into the jungle, no longer caring about the noise I was making or the branches whipping at my face. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing miles from the village. As I lay there, gasping for breath, the full weight of what I'd witnessed crashed down on me. Tears streamed down my face as I sobbed uncontrollably, my mind struggling to process the impossible horrors I'd seen. The rest of that night is a blur in my memory. I know I didn't sleep. How could I with those images seared into my brain? As soon as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I was on my feet again, putting as much distance between myself and that accursed village as possible. It took me 3 more days of hard trekking before I finally picked up a signal on my satellite phone. When my support team found me, they said I looked like I'd aged years in the weeks I'd been gone. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd seen. Who would believe such a fantastic and horrific tale? I've tried to convince myself that it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, horrors lurking in the dark places that we were never meant to discover. And somewhere out there, hidden in the depths of the Amazon, an ancient evil continues its grotesque rituals, waiting for the next unsuspecting explorer to stumble upon its lair. I won't be going back into the jungle. My days of exploration are over. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear that chanting again, calling to me from across the miles. And I wonder, did I truly escape, or did I bring something back with me, something that's slowly taking root in my soul? All I know is that the horrors I witnessed in that hidden village will stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the terrible secrets that lurk in the unexplored corners of our world. I was a wildlife biologist, dedicated to studying the intricate ecosystems of remote wetlands. Little did I know that my latest expedition would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about nature and human nature alike. It was supposed to be a routine survey of a secluded swamp, mapping out the flora and fauna in this little explored region. I'd been trekking through the muck for hours, swatting away mosquitoes and documenting the various species I encountered. The air was thick and humid, filled with the drone of insects and occasional bird calls. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed something odd in the distance, what looked like a dilapidated wooden structure barely visible through the tangle of cypress trees and Spanish moss. Curious, I made my way towards it, my boots squelching in the boggy ground with each step. Drawing closer, I saw it was an old cabin, weathered and sagging but still mostly intact. It seemed completely out of place in this wild, isolated area. Who would build a dwelling so deep in the swamp, miles from any road or town? My scientific curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate further. As I approached the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up. Something about this place felt off, wrong somehow. But I brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The wooden steps creaked ominously as I climbed onto the small porch. Peering through a grimy window, I could make out vague shapes inside, but no signs of current habitation. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the faint breeze. "Hello?" I called out, more out of habit than expectation of a response. Only silence greeted me. Pushing the door open wider, I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight as my eyes adjusted to the dim interior. What I saw made me freeze in my tracks. The single room was a chaotic mess, but not the kind you'd expect from a long-abandoned shack. There were clear signs of recent occupation, dirty dishes in a makeshift sink, a rumpled sleeping bag in the corner, even a battery-powered lamp that still flickered weakly. But it was the walls that sent a chill down my spine. Every inch was covered in scrawled writing and crude drawings, rambling phrases, mathematical equations, and diagrams of something. Plants? Animals? The longer I looked, the less sense they made. It was like peering into the mind of a madman. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a calendar hanging crookedly on one wall. It was open to the current month, with days crossed off right up to yesterday. Someone had been here very recently. I knew I should leave immediately, but my eyes were drawn to a rickety desk covered in papers. Despite my better judgment, I stepped closer to examine them. They appeared to be field notes of some kind, but but describing creatures I'd never seen or even heard of before. Impossible chimeras that defied the laws of biology. A rustling sound outside made me jump. I whirled around, heart pounding. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of movement in the underbrush. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. No answer, but I could have sworn I heard labored breathing. That was enough for me. I turned to make a hasty exit, but my elbow knocked a stack of papers off the desk. As they scattered across the floor, my blood ran cold. Mixed in with the notes were photographs, dozens of them. They showed grotesque mutations, plants and animals fused together in ways that shouldn't be possible. And in the background of several shots, barely visible, was a human figure watching from the shadows. I had to get out of there, now. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it suddenly slammed shut. I tugged frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rising, I spun around, searching desperately for another way out. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the far corner of the room, partially hidden in shadow. How long had he been there? How had I not noticed him before? He was tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair and beard. But it was his eyes that terrified me most, wide and feverish, filled with a mixture of fear and manic energy. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice hoarse as if from disuse. "You've seen too much. Can't let you leave now." I backed away as he took a shambling step forward. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Who was this man? What had he been doing out here? Those creatures in the photos? Had he somehow created them? "Please," I said, holding my hands up placatingly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm just a biologist doing a survey. I'll leave and forget I ever saw this place." He shook his head violently. No, can't risk it. They'll find out. They'll come for me, for my work. Can't let that happen." I was fully in fight or flight mode now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As he lurched towards me, I acted on instinct. I grabbed the lamp from the desk and hurled it at him with all my might. It struck him in the chest, momentarily stunning him. In that split second, I charged forward, shouldering past him and slamming into the door with my full weight. The old wood splintered, and I burst out onto the porch, nearly falling down the steps in my haste. I heard an enraged bellow behind me as I sprinted into the swamp. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, my feet slipping in the muck. My pursuer crashed through the underbrush behind me, closing the distance with inhuman speed. The next few minutes were a blur of terror. I zigzagged between trees, splashed through murky pools, ducked under low-hanging vines. All the while, I could hear him right on my heels, his ragged breathing and occasional animalistic grunts spurring me to even greater speeds. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away from that madman and his nightmarish cabin. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I found myself sliding down a muddy embankment. I tumbled head over heels, coming to rest in shallow, stagnant water. Dazed and winded, I struggled to my feet, expecting at any moment to feel hands grabbing me. But the sounds of pursuit had stopped. I looked around wildly, trying to get my bearings. There was no sign of the man. Had I lost him? Or was he lying in wait, ready to pounce? I slogged through the knee-deep water, fighting waves of exhaustion and nausea. The light was failing as evening approached, casting long shadows through the trees. Every snapping twig or flutter of wings made me flinch. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled out of the swamp onto firmer ground. In the distance, I could see the glow of lights, civilization at last. I wanted to weep with relief. As I trudged towards safety, my mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? What was he doing in that isolated cabin? And those pictures, those impossible creatures, were they real? Had he somehow found a way to create new life forms? Or was it all just the product of a deranged mind? I knew I should report what I'd seen to the authorities. But who would believe such an outlandish tale? And some irrational part of me feared that by speaking about it, I'd somehow draw the madman's attention again. In the end, I told no one. I made up a story about getting lost in the swamp to explain my bedraggled state and aborted survey mission. But I never returned to that area again. Some mysteries, I decided, were better left unsolved. To this day, I'm haunted by what I saw in that cabin. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, a hallucination brought on by heat exhaustion, perhaps. But then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those mutated creatures vivid in my mind, and I'll lie awake, straining my ears for the sound of shambling footsteps, terrified that one day the madman of the swamp will find me again to ensure his secrets stay buried. The experience changed me. I gave up my field work, taking a safe desk job instead. I can't stand to be in wild places anymore. They no longer feel like sanctuaries of nature, but rather places where dark, inexplicable things might be lurking just out of sight. I try to tell myself it's over, that I'm safe now. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever I stumbled upon that day in the swamp is still out there. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a faint, raspy voice calling to me from the shadows. You've seen too much. Can't let you leave now. I carefully picked my way down a steep, overgrown path to reach the pebbly beach below. The cove was hemmed in by towering rock walls on three sides, with waves crashing against the shoreline. As I caught my breath and took in the scenery, something caught my eye. What looked like the shadowy entrance to a cave, partially hidden behind some boulders. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my headlamp from my pack and cautiously made my way over the slippery rocks towards the cave mouth. As I got closer, I could feel cool air wafting out from the darkness within. The opening was larger than it had first appeared, easily big enough for me to walk through upright. I flicked on my headlamp and peered inside. The beam of light revealed a vast cavern stretching back into inky blackness. Jagged stalactites hung from the ceiling, glinting as my light passed over them. The ground was uneven but seemed passable. My heart quickened with excitement at the prospect of exploring this hidden underground world. I knew I should probably turn back. Caves can be dangerous, especially when exploring alone. But the allure of adventure pulled at me. I figured I'd just take a quick look around near the entrance. I could always come back another time with proper caving gear and a buddy. I stepped into the cool dimness of the cave, my footsteps echoing off the damp rock walls. The air felt thick and heavy in my lungs. I moved slowly, sweeping my headlamp back and forth to take in my surroundings. Countless tiny droplets of water clung to every surface, sparkling in the beam of light. About 50 feet in, the passageway narrowed and twisted to the left. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed on. As I rounded the bend, the cave opened up into an immense chamber. My light couldn't even reach the far walls or ceiling. I stood in awe, marveling at the vast space hidden beneath the earth. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on loose rocks, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out. My voice reverberated through the chamber. No response. I stood frozen, straining my ears. For several long moments, only silence. Then, there it was again. The slow, deliberate sound of someone walking, but it seemed to be coming from a different direction now. "Is someone there?" I shouted, a tremor in my voice. Again, no answer. Just more footsteps, circling around me. Panic started to set in. I swept my headlamp wildly around the cavern, but the beam couldn't penetrate far enough into the gloom to reveal anything. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the scrape of shoes on stone, the clatter of disturbed pebbles. But I couldn't see anyone. My breath came in ragged gasps as adrenaline flooded my system. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I chose flight. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, desperate to reach the safety of daylight. But in my panicked state, I quickly lost my bearings in the twisting passageways. Every shadow seemed to loom menacingly. Every rock formation looked unfamiliar. And always those footsteps pursued me, echoing from all directions. I don't know how long I ran through that nightmare maze of tunnels. My legs burned and my lungs heaved. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. I stumbled and fell several times, scraping my hands and knees on the jagged floor. But terror kept me moving, scrambling back to my feet each time. At one point, I thought I glimpsed movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure darting between stalagmites. But when I turned to look, nothing was there, just endless, oppressive darkness. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. Unseen eyes seemed to bore into me from every shadow. An overwhelming sense of malevolent presence pressed in on all sides. I felt like prey being toyed with before the kill. Just when I was on the verge of total breakdown, thinking I would die alone in this stone labyrinth, I spotted a faint glow up ahead. Daylight. With a final burst of desperate energy, I sprinted towards it. I burst out of the cave entrance and collapsed onto the pebbly beach, gasping for air. The late afternoon sun nearly blinded me after so long in the dark. I lay there for several minutes, trembling as the sound of the waves washed over me. Finally, I gathered the courage to look back at the cave mouth. It loomed there, a yawning black hole in the cliffside. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows just inside the entrance. A dark, hunched shape, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I scrambled to my feet and fled up the path to the cliff top, not stopping until I reached my campsite. I broke camp in record time and hiked through the night to reach the nearest town, too afraid to sleep alone in the wilderness. It's been years, but I still have nightmares about that cave. The sound of those footsteps haunts me. I've tried to research the area to see if there are any legends about the cave or reports of similar experiences, but I've found nothing concrete. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just in my head, some kind of panic attack brought on by claustrophobia and an overactive imagination. But then I remember the visceral terror I felt, the absolute certainty that something was in there with me, something that wanted to hurt me. I'll never go caving again, and I'll never forget the horror of being hunted through the darkness by an unseen presence. Whatever was in that coastal cave, I hope it stays there, hidden away from the world of light and reason.